Welcome to BlockForge, the most ambitious and impressive project that we've created on this channel. As you can see in the hero section, as you scroll down, you'll have these large 3D shapes that move along with the scroll position and animated SVGs that add another level of polish to this section. When we go down to the feature cards section, you'll notice that they animate automatically, but if we hover over any one of these features, you can see that there's almost this light that turns on from this cut corner card that we'll create, as well as the 3D shape that animates along with that hover movement. Scrolling down below that, we have features with these large 3D parallax effects on either side that really add another level of polish to this section. And then down below that, we'll have a blog section that is complete with two columns that independently move from each other. And if we hover over those, you'll notice that those light up as well, just like our other cards did. And even in the testimonials, we haven't left anything out because those smoothly animate into the page. And in the call to action section, you still have 3D shapes animating with the mouse scroll. But we're taking this one step further because we're building every single page of this site. If we go up into the navigation, you can see we have blog, careers, and contact. As we head over to the blog, we still have an animated header, and each blog article animates onto the page as we scroll down. If we go to a blog article, you'll see that we still have our animated header, and of course, we have lorem ipsum for the article text, but you can read the entire article. Over in the careers page, we have careers that animate onto the page. And if we click one of those careers, we can see it takes us to the contact page where we can fill in our information. This includes a special cut corner input and cut corner text areas, as well as a cut corner button. This is the most impressive site that we've done yet. And I'm going to teach you how to build this whole site from scratch. But before we dive in, make sure you grab the resources that are linked in the description below. These are 100% completely free resources that include not only the design files and the starter code template, but every single image and asset that you need in order to complete this project. This video is going to be covering part 1 of this build, so make sure you subscribe so you know when the next parts are released. Once you've downloaded your starter template, simply open up your favorite IDE, drag and drop your starter template into your IDE, and you should be able to get started from there. Once you get your project open, the first thing you're going to want to do is come into your terminal and go ahead and run npm install. That should go ahead and install all of the dependencies that you need in order to get this project up and running. And you'll notice that it did give me a node modules folder that now has all of my dependencies installed. So I know that those are installed. Before we run our project for the first time, let's go ahead and take a look at our project structure so that we can understand what's going on in this site. So first we have our public folder. That's going to be holding all of our assets, including the images that we need. So those will all be available for us right there in that public folder. Whenever this Astro site gets served, all of these will get served as well, meaning we'll have access to all of our assets and images that way. Inside of this source directory, we have a few different folders. Now, the main folder we're going to want to pay attention to is our pages directory, because that one is going to hold all of our pages for this particular site. So the home page is going to be this index.astro page. And of course, inside of the blog, we're going to have other pages there as well. Now, these Astro files, if you have not worked with Astro before, they basically are HTML, but then you can also include components inside of these Astro files. You can see I have these 3 dashes at the top of my Astro file, and I'm actually importing a component from another file and then using that component. So this will be something that is sort of similar to how JSX and TSX are written. And of course, if you've ever used React components before, you're used to this syntax where we have these components that allow us to insert JSX inside them. So Astro is very similar to that. We're going to talk a little bit about the differences between Astro and JSX as we move along. However, we're not going to use too many Astro files, but our pages themselves are going to be Astro files. And then most things we are going to create with JSX and React. Inside of our layouts directory, since you can see that we're importing the default layout here, let's go ahead and look at what that default layout looks like. So our default layout is also an Astro file, and it is importing our global CSS, and then it's basically defining the structure of the page for us. Let me go ahead and close my terminal real quick so we can see this a little bit better. So we can see that it has our HTML, our basic HTML structure. With our head, we are bringing in some Google fonts. We're also importing our Tailwind CSS files here. And then you can see we have this slot tag. Now, slot is essentially children in React. It's where we put the child or children of a particular component. So slot is where we're going to be dropping in the children of our layout. So basically everything is going to go within our body tag, and then it's going to be wrapped within this default layout that we have defined here. Since we're importing our globals.css, let's go ahead and look at what that looks like as well. If we go over to the styles directory, we can see that we have a global.css file, and that's essentially just a basic Tailwind import file, but we're also doing a couple of things to the body. We're going ahead and setting anti-aliased so that our outputted code will be very accurate to the design. We're also going ahead and making this dark by adding the background zinc 900, and the text is very light with a text zinc 300 color. And then we're setting font body. This is something that's coming from our Tailwind config, where we're basically saying the body font is Carla and then the heading font is Inter. So that's all defined within our Tailwind config, but this is all we're doing within our global.css. For our other folders here, we have a components folder. If we have a reusable component that we want to define, we'll go ahead and save that inside of our components folder, and that will allow us to use it in several sections of the page. We also have content, which we'll get into later, but content is basically going to be the content of our blog when we create that. And then down here in the sections folder, this is just going to be how we're going to stay organized within our pages. So of course our pages are a collection of sections. Our sections can include components. So we're just going to try and stay organized with how we create our code so that we're not looking at too much code at once and getting overwhelmed with what we're seeing. So with that, let's go ahead and close up all of our directories within our source directory. I'm going to open up the bottom terminal again, and I'm going to say npm run dev. That should start the Astro dev server, and that will enable us to get this site started. Once you have the site up and running, you should be able to open it up in a browser at the URL that is defined by Astro here. So it looks like that is the localhost 4321. On a Mac, I use command click to follow that URL, but of course you can just copy and paste that into any web browser that you would like to use. Now over here on my right, you've noticed that I've opened up my Polypane browser. This is the browser that I'm going to be using because it's going to show us all of our responsive views as we're building this site. So I have 3 responsive views set up. I'm going to pull this browser window out so you can have a little bit of a better view. So I have my mobile view over here. That's going to be my 375 pixel width size. You also see I have my tablet view and my desktop. That's going to be the 1200 pixel width size. And we are going to build it mobile first. So we're going to start with the mobile size. There's a couple of great things about using this Polypane browser. Number one is, of course, you can see all of your responsive views all in one. The other great tool that we're going to be using is a reference image. So I'm going to be able to drop my reference image for each of these views beside the view itself so that I can see what's going on in my reference image and make sure as I'm coding that I have a great view of that reference image. And there I was just able to open up the mobile reference image, and I'm going to go ahead and add reference images to tablet and desktop as well so that as we're coding, we can see where we're at. Now that I have that set up, I'm going to go ahead and slide my browser window back over and go ahead and focus on my mobile view. If you've never used Astro before, I wanted to take a second and kind of introduce what the Astro framework is and how it's a little bit different than the framework that I've been using in my other videos, Next.js. Astro is a web framework for content-driven websites, and that's the important part that I wanted to call out here, is that they have specific APIs for being able to interact with content in a very good way. So for things like blogs, like we're doing with this particular site, this is a perfect fit. And of course, it shows you a little bit about who uses Astro. You can see that Google, Microsoft, The Guardian. So a lot of good names are already using Astro as part of their framework strategy. Now, Astro is content driven. It's also server first, which means that Astro improves website performance by rendering components first on the server. So even when we're writing React, it will render that server first and serve that, and only load the JavaScript for that if we actually tell it to. There is also something called Astro Islands, which we'll get familiar with. But essentially, Astro Islands make sure that our site stays quick and snappy as we're building. So you can see that here, there was a study done that shows that Astro can be faster even than Next.js in some particular cases. There's also a great part about Astro, and that is that you can combine front-end technologies in Astro pages. So if I wanted to, I could write components in React, I could write them in Vue, Preact, all of those, and then bring them together in an Astro page. Now we're going to be using some of this functionality by writing React components and bringing them into our Astro pages, but I wanted to make you aware that there is a lot of other flexibility that you can do with Astro and actually bring things together. And then there's a bunch of features that it goes through down here, as well as themes. That's what we're going to be building with. We're going to be building with the Astro framework just because it's a really good fit for what we're going to be doing in this project. As we're getting started with this project, let's go ahead and take a look at the design of the header. So right now you can see that we have the logo and we have a little nav icon up here to the right. Both of those things we're going to be building, and there's a little bit of opacity and blur underneath this header as well. So you can see that there is a part of a shape that goes under, and it's very difficult to actually make out that that blur is there just because that shape is so light right now. But we do know that we want to add some opacity and blur to the background so that as we scroll, it makes a great effect as it goes over things like other shapes and the text of the page. Over in our tablet view, you can see that for the first time, we start to see our Get Started button also appear next to our navigation hamburger icon. So that is going to be a cut corner button. It's going to be an interesting challenge for us to create this little cut corner effect, but we will learn the techniques in order to create that button. And of course, we still see the same logo and the same hamburger icon to the left and right of this nav menu. And then over on the desktop, you can see that we see sort of the same thing, just a little bit wider. So we're still seeing our cut corner button, still our hamburger menu, and of course our logo as well. So let's go ahead with that and go ahead and dive into our code. Back in our code, let's go ahead and add the header section to our page. So I'm going to go inside of sections and I'm going to create a new file called header.tsx. Now this TSX extension means that it's going to parse this in React. So of course, from now on, we can just go ahead and write normal React. So I'm going to say export const header section, and I'm going to make that equal to a component that could take in some props, and it's going to return a value for now of div header section. Now that text inside that div will allow us to just see if we have wired up this section correctly once we put it in our page. So from there, I'm going to go over to my pages, and inside of my index.astro, I'm going to import that same header section in here. So I'm going to import header section from /sections/header, and that should import that header section. And then I'm going to replace my h1 with my header section component. So I'm just going to do that. And as soon as we hit save, we should see our header section text showing up here to the right, which of course we do, which means our header section is wired up correctly. Once we've done that, we can close out our index.astro page because we won't need to take a look at that until we import our next section. Inside of our header section, let's go ahead and delete the header section text and go ahead and start to create the code for this particular section. So we know we want a container to keep our content inside. So we'll say div class name equals container, and that will keep the content from bumping up against the edges of the page. We'll want a flexed container to have left and right content. So I'm going to say div class name equals flex right here. And we'll go ahead and say justify between, just to go ahead and get them spaced between each other. And then I'm going to go ahead and create two divs, one for the left and one for the right. So I'm going to create those two divs. inside of our first div, we're going to have our logo. So let's go ahead and see if we can just grab that logo. We can either use an image or we can directly drop in the SVG. I think in this case, all I'm going to do is go ahead and use an image tag to go ahead and show our logo. So I'm going to come over here and write an image tag. The source of that is going to be where our logo is stored, which is going to be /assets/images/logo.svg. And as the logo, we'll also go ahead and give it an alt tag, and we'll just see block forge logo. And that should work. So if I save that, we do see our logo showing up right there. Over on the other side, we know that we're going to show our hamburger navigation menu. And this is interesting because we're going to actually build this as a custom component rather than creating an SVG or something like that, because we're going to animate this in the future. So I'm going to actually just go ahead and build out my hamburger menu. So we're going to start with a wrapping div. That's going to have a class name of size 10, which is going to make it 40 by 40. And then we're going to position those bars inside that. So we're going to make this relative in order to position the bars inside them. We need 2 bars. So one of them is going to be div class name equals absolute. And of course, we're just going to duplicate this in the future. And then the bar itself inside of the absolute positioned element is going to be div class name equals, and then we'll go ahead and create the actual bar classes. So we're going to have a width of 20 pixels. We're going to have a height of actually 2 pixels. And of course, the background is going to be equal to the white text on our page, which is going to be a Zinc 300 for that. So let's see if we actually see that bar show up. And I do see the first bar showing up here, which is good. Now, we have a 40 by 40 container. We want this bar to be positioned to the center of it. So in my absolute container, I'm going to say left 1/2, top 1/2, and then negative translate X 1/2 and negative translate Y 1/2. And that will enable my bar to show up exactly in the center of our hamburger icon. Now you'll see why we do this in the future when we start to animate this, but for now, just trust me that we want to put both of these exactly in the center. So essentially we want to have 2 of these, we want to have them positioned on top of each other. And I'll probably show you here in a second why I'm doing this, just so you can see what we're going to do in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that for our second bar. You're not going to see any changes because they're both on top of each other right now. Now this gives us a lot of options for what we can do with these couple of bars. Let me go ahead and close out my sidebar so I can see the code a little bit better. And I'm also going to go ahead and turn on word wrap for this particular component as well, so we can see all of the classes that are being used. Now first, in order to make our 2 hamburger lines instead of just 1, we need to translate one of these up and we need to translate one of these a little bit down. So I'm going to the first one, I'm going to add a class of negative translate Y1, and that should pull it up by 4 pixels. And then for the second one, I'm going to add a class of translate Y1, and that should pull it down by 4 pixels. And that just makes that hamburger icon there. Now, when we're ready to animate this, what we're actually going to do is take those bars and actually turn them into an X when we want to open and close our menu. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is, instead of translating up and down, I'm going to rotate instead. So if I take this off, if I take my negative translate Y1 off and say rotate 45, then you can see that'll be one part of my X. And I'll do the same thing with this other one. I'll take this translate Y1 off and I'll say negative rotate 45. And you can see that'll be the other side of my X. So we're actually going to make a transition that goes between our bar hamburger icon into this X by rotating and translating these different bars around. So that's what we're going for. That's why we're actually building this from scratch. So let me go ahead and put those classes back in. Negative translate Y1. And of course, the other one is going to be translate Y1. And that will make our hamburger menu. Now we know that we don't want our logo to not be aligned with our menu. So let's go ahead and add items center here. And that should allow our logo to be aligned. And we also want our whole flex container to be a specific height to take up the space on the page. So I'm going to give that a class of H24, and that will give it the 96 pixels of height that we see in the design. Now we're not seeing this yet, but we know that inside of this header section, we're going to want to add some background blur, and we're going to want to make this sticky to the top. We're not going to be able to test this out yet because we're not to that point, but that's fine. Let me go ahead and replace my wrapping div with a semantic header tag. I just realized that I didn't do that before, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that. And then we're also going to add a class onto this to go ahead and make it sticky. So I'm gonna say sticky top 0 so that it immediately sticks to the top of the page as we scroll. And then we're also gonna add the background to it as well. So I'm gonna say BG Zinc 900/50. That's going to make the background this same color as the background of our page, but with a 50% opacity. And then we'll just say backdrop blur large, and then that should make the blur effect. Now we're not going to see any of this or be able to test this yet. That's fine. We'll come back to that when we get the chance. In order to see if this actually aligns with my design, I'm going to go ahead and bring my design and overlay it on top of my current page. So I'm going to go to my reference images. I'm going to say overlaid, and let's go ahead and see if that aligns to the same pixels as the design. And it looks like it does. It looks like that's perfect right now on my mobile view, which means I can go ahead and move on to my other responsive views. Moving over to my tablet view, let's go ahead and pull this out just a little bit to get a better view of my tablet screen. It looks like right now the one difference is the cut corner button that we need to bring in to this header on the tablet view that's now visible. In order to create that cut corner button, let's go ahead and just start creating the button itself, and then we'll figure out how we're going to do the cut corner part of this. Now that's actually going to be an SVG that we're going to drop into there, and we're going to use some masking and some other techniques in order to get that little bit of a cut corner effect there. But first, let's go ahead and just create the button itself. So I'm going to go into the second div, which is the part of my Flex container that contains my hamburger navigation icon, and I'm going to go ahead and create the button in there. So I'm just going to drop in that button. It has a text of get started, and we're going to have, of course, some class names that we're going to add here to style it up. So the first class name we're going to do is the BG Fuchsia 500, and we're going to make that have 20% opacity with /20. Let me go ahead and scroll back over here so we can get an idea of how that's looking. And actually, let me go ahead and pull out my browser window just a little bit more so that we can get a look at it when we go ahead and align these items as well. I'm also going to flex my button and my hamburger side by side by adding a class name equals flex right here. And to space them out between each other, I'm also going to say gap 4 and items center, and that will allow me to make sure they're spaced correctly. Inside of my button, I need to continue to add classes here to style this up. So I want to give it a little bit of padding left and right. So I'm going to say px4 to give it that padding, and then I'm going to say py2 to give it the padding top and bottom. We want the text to also have the correct classes, the right size and weight and all of that. So I'm going to say font extra bold in order to set the font weight. We're going to have uppercase to make the text uppercase. Font heading is actually something that's a custom class from our Tailwind CSS config. That's going to make it the inter font. And then we're going to say text small to make it a smaller font size, and then tracking wide to make the letter spacing increased on this button. Okay, so far so good on all of that. Let's go ahead and work on the outline. So this is a little bit interesting because we want to go ahead and wrap a span tag around our text so that we can separate this from other elements we can stick inside of our button. But instead of a normal border, we're actually going to use an outline here. And that's because we want to be able to easily cut off part of that border in order to show the SVG that we're going to show for our border itself. So I'm going to create a separate div in here, and that div is going to have a class name of absolute, and it is going to be over the entire button. So it's going to be inset 0, and it's what's going to contain the quote unquote border. But instead of a border, we're going to use an outline. So I'm going to say outline. The outline is going to have a thickness of 2. We're also going to say negative outline offset to make it inside of our button, and then it's going to have a color of that fuchsia 500. So I'm going to say outline fuchsia 500, and that should make it the right color. Now this is absolutely positioned, but our button is not relatively positioned yet. So let me go ahead and add the relative class on there. That should constrain the border to the right spot. Now, as we can see, the button in our actual page and the button over in our design still look a little bit different. It looks like this one is a little bit bigger, and of course we still have the cut corner part to get to. So in order to kind of make those a little bit more equal, what I'm going to do is, it looks like there's a little bit more spacing on the top and bottom of my header as we get up into this medium size. So I'm going to give this the responsive modifier of medium and say H28. That should get my sizing of the header to be correct. Now for my actual button, we want to make sure that it gets to the full 40 pixels that it looks like this button is. And right now it definitely isn't. It does have a PY2, which is going to give it padding top and bottom of 16. But of course, in order to get the full 40 pixels, we need to make sure that our span has the right line height. So I'm going to say class name equals leading 6. That should give it the line height that it needs in order to make it the right size. Now that we have those things done, let's go ahead and overlay our reference image and see how close we've gotten. So far, we're actually very close. The only other thing we need to take care of is our cut corner. So let's go ahead and see how we're going to implement that effect. I'm going to pull my design over to my side again, and then we're going to actually bring in our cut corner SVG. Now, if we go over into our public/asset/images, you can see that we have this cut corner SVG. I'm actually going to copy and paste this and go ahead and drop it right into the button itself. So it's also going to be absolutely positioned. I'm going to drop it under my other absolutely positioned element. Just go ahead and save it as so. And let's go ahead and bring our sidebar back out so that we can see our code. Now we need to add a class name to it to make sure it's absolutely positioned. So I'm going to say class name equals, and it's going to be absolute. It's going to go to the top right. So top 0, right 0. We also want to make sure that it has the right color. So you can see that the stroke is whatever the current color of the text is. So if we say text fuchsia 500 here, that will make the stroke that same color. Now all we need to do is make sure that our other part of our border is being hidden where our SVG is being shown. So we need to add some sort of a mask to make sure that that part of that border is not being shown where our SVG is being shown. So I'm going to come up here to my absolutely positioned outline and say mask image, and we're going to use a linear gradient. We essentially want this to be negative 45 degrees. So we want this kind of to come from the top right, but we want it to come down at an even angle. So I'm going to say 225 degrees, and that's going to be from transparent because the first thing that we'd want to show is nothing. And then at some point, we want to once again go ahead and show our border. So let's try taking it out, let's say 10 pixels. So I'm going to say transparent 10 pixels. So the transparent will stop at 10 pixels. And then we're going to transition right to black to show things. So I'm going to say black 10 pixels, and then that should be all there is to that. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's see if that makes our border cut. And it looks like it does. It looks like it makes that great effect. We still see the background color of our button, but of course we're seeing the SVG, and then we're seeing the outline. To actually see what that did, let me go ahead and just comment out my SVG for a second so we can see what that border looks like with that masked image in there. So I'm going to comment that out, and you can see that it's just taking away that part of the border, and then we're just filling it in with this absolutely positioned SVG that we also have overlaid on top of our border. With that, let's go ahead and make sure that it looks perfect to the design. So I'm going to go ahead and overlay my design once again, and we will go ahead and have a look and see if we have everything lined up. And it looks like we do. So that means that we can move on to the desktop responsive view. Moving over to my desktop view, I don't see any differences right offhand. I'm going to go ahead and pull this out even more just so we can get a better view of our desktop view. So it looks like we have our header here, and it looks like we have our header design to the right, and I'm not seeing any differences right offhand, but of course we can double check that by overlaying our reference image and then seeing if that lines up perfectly. And it looks like it does line up perfectly, which means for now we are done with our header section. It's time to move on to the hero. As I come back over, I forgot to check my mobile design as well, but as I come back over to my mobile design, I can see that now I'm actually showing my button where I shouldn't be showing it. So let me go ahead and bring my code out a little bit so that we can take care of this responsive problem that we have where we're showing our button where we shouldn't be showing it. All we need to do is essentially ensure that it's hidden on the mobile view, and then as soon as we go to the medium tablet view, we show it again. So let me go ahead and add a hidden class on this by just saying hidden. And then, of course, when we come into the tablet view on the medium size, we want to show it as something else. So let me just go ahead and try inline flex and see how that looks as my medium display property. So I can see that it is displaying as inline flex. Let me double check that the overlaid design is still looking perfect, and it looks like it is. And then over at the desktop view, I wanted to just double check this as well by overlaying my design and making sure everything is still looking good, which it is. So we took care of that responsive issue. That's now taken care of, which means we can now actually move on to the hero section of the page. Coming back to our design, let's look at what we're going to do in the hero section of our page. So we already completed the header, which means we can tackle the hero section. It looks like we have some eyebrow text here. We have a title, we have a description, we have the same cut corner button. So we're probably going to make that a component. And you can see that we have this image, this 3D image that we're going to have some effects on eventually. It's going to rotate and do all that fun stuff. We can also see that we have a scroll to learn more, which we're going to create statically for now. And if you'll notice, you'll also see that we have these really faint lines that show up in the hero section of our page. When we go over to the tablet and desktop, you'll see more of what those are, but those are showing up as well. All of those we'll have to account for with our hero design. And then over in the tablet view, we start to see more of those outline images that we know we're going to be adding to our page. So we're starting to see our cube being added up here to the right. We're seeing our cuboid being added up here to the bottom right as well. We still see our scroll to learn more. And of course, we see some more of those outlines. The image did get a little bit bigger. I think the text got a little bit bigger as well. So we'll have to account for both of those things. And then over in our desktop view, then we're starting to really see the full effect of this wonderful hero section. It really looks nice. We have these big hexagon shapes that are coming around the edges of this icosahedron shape. And we're starting to see our torus image over here on the left. And of course, our text did get a little bit bigger as well. So we'll account for all of those things in the build of this hero section. With that, let's go ahead and dive into the code. Coming back into our code, it's time for us to create a new section. So let's go ahead into the sections directory and go ahead and create a new file. And let's call this hero.tsx. Inside that hero.tsx, we're going to make this a React component. So we're going to export the hero section or export const hero section. And that's going to be equal to a function that's going to return, for now, just an h1 that says hero section. And we'll go ahead and save that, and then we'll drop that into our page. Over in our pages directory, let's go back into the index.astro file, and we're going to import that hero section from /sections/hero, and that should import that hero section component. And then we can just drop our hero section component right below our header section. So I'm going to drop that hero section component there and hit save. If we've done that correctly, we should see hero section over here in our page. So it looks like we have that all wired up, which means I'm going to go ahead and close down our index page and just concentrate on our hero section. Let me go ahead and remove my h1, and I'm going to go ahead and create a semantic section tag. Inside that section, we know we are going to have a container. So I'm going to go ahead and create that with a div class name equals container to make sure that our content is not touching the edges of the page. And then inside that container, we're going to create our content. So I'm going to create a paragraph for that eyebrow, and we're going to say introducing Blockforge. For the title of the page, we're going to make that an h1, a semantic h1 tag. That's going to say the future of blockchain is here, the capital H. And then for the description, we also want that to be a semantic paragraph tag. So that's going to say Blockforge is pioneering smart contract integrity with cutting edge data solutions. And in order to see that all on one part of the page, I'm going to go ahead and turn on word wrap as well. So I'm going to just toggle word wrap. That should allow us to see all of our content so far. And then we have our get started button as well. Now we've already created a get started button. So this might be the perfect opportunity for us to go ahead and create a component out of that button so that we don't have to keep recreating that button time and time again. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do. I'm going to come into my components folder and I'm going to go ahead and create a new file, and we'll call this cut corner button.tsx, and that'll allow us to create this as a React component. So I'm going to go ahead and export const cut corner button, and we're going to make it return some JSX. And for now, I'm just going to return a simple button tag that says get started. But of course, we're going to go ahead and replace this with the content that we've already created inside of our header section. So let's go into our sections/header.tsx file, and let's find where we've created that button already, and then we can just drop it into the component that we've created. So you can see that we have this button here. This button is going to encapsulate an absolute position div. It's going to encapsulate our SVG, and it's going to encapsulate our text. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy that whole bit of HTML or JSX there, and I'm going to bring that into our cut corner button, and I'm just going to paste it right here. So we can see that it has this button tag, and let me just go ahead and toggle the word wrap on this as well. But it has the button tag with the classes here. It has the absolutely positioned outline, it has the SVG, and of course it has our text as well. So that's what's going to be returned with the cut corner button, but of course we want to be able to change the text inside of it. So we're going to go ahead and make sure that we can do that. And the other thing we're going to want to be able to do is be able to change the class name. So we're going to want to be able to add classes here in case we want to say add margin top or position it differently. We're going to want to be able to add things there. And you can actually see that we have hidden and medium inline flex. Well, these are things that are specific to the implementation of our button in our header. So we don't want to include those classes in here either, but we want to make this editable as well. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and bring in those props. So we're going to have our props that are being brought in, and the easiest way to type these is to go ahead and use the component props without ref that's provided by React. So let's just go ahead and try and do that. I'm going to start typing component props. You can see we have this component props without ref, and then we just need to tell it what type of props we're talking about, and we're talking about specifically for the button tag, and that will type these props with class name and children and all the other things we need to get out of these props right here. So that works well. Let's go ahead and pull those different props out. So I'm going to say const, and I'm going to pull out class name. I'm also going to pull out children from our props, right, like that, and then we can go ahead and use class name and children. So first I'm going to replace the text with children. Just going to go ahead and do that. That's going to allow us to replace the text of this button. And then we also want to add a dynamic class name. Now we have not yet used in this particular project the Tailwind merge function, but I think this is the perfect application for us to bring that in. So I'm going to import the TW merge from Tailwind merge, and then I'm going to drop that into my class name. Now what this is going to do is it's going to enable us to have some specific classes that are always going to be added. But if we add more classes, which we can do by just dropping in class name here, then it's going to make any overrides that are passed in through props override anything in here if it's applicable. So if there's something that needs overridden, this is going to be kind of the base classes, and then these are going to be any overrides if applicable. This Tailwind merge is excellent when you're creating components with Tailwind because it will make sure that your classes are not colliding with each other and doing things that are strange that you might not expect. Now that we have our cut corner button component created, let's go ahead and first implement it inside of our header. So I'm going to come up to the top of my header file, and I'm going to say import cut corner button. That's going to come from component/cut corner button. So I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to replace my button here with my cut corner button. Now I'm going to do it by dropping it in above it for now. So I'm going to say cut corner button. We know that the text is going to be get started. And we're also going to have custom classes here as well. So I'm going to say class name equals, and then we're going to pass it in the couple of classes that were specific to this implementation. So that's going to be these hidden and medium inline flex. We want those classes to be passed in here because we want this button to be hidden on mobile, and then of course inline flexed when it comes to the tablet size. So with that, let me go ahead and remove my button, JSX. We're going to leave our cut corner button in there, and I'm going to hit save, and let's see what changes. So I'm going to go over to my different views, and it looks like those still look great, which means that we have implemented this component correctly, and we can now use it inside of our hero component. So I'm going to close my header.tsx and close my cut corner button because we don't need to look at that component anymore. And I'm going to import my cut corner button into here. So import cut corner button from @components/cut corner button. And then under my paragraph, I'm going to drop this in. So I'm going to say cut corner button, and it's going to say get started. Now that we have that in there, the last part of our content of this section is our image that falls below our button. So let me go ahead and drop that in as well, just with a simple image tag. So I'm going to say image source equals /assets/images/icosahedron.png, I believe is the name of the image. And then I'm going to add an alt tag as well. I'm going to say icosahedron 3D image, and that should enable our image tag to show. And of course, because it's React, we have to add the slash on our image. It's not HTML. Okay, so that's our icosahedron image that we want to be dropped in here as well. The surround for this is actually, we'll do that when we come back and do all of our styles. Now that we have the content in this section, let's go ahead and start creating the styles that will allow this section to match the design. So let's go ahead and start with the eyebrow and go ahead and add some classes onto here to ensure that it has the right style. So I'm going to say class name equals, and we want this to be uppercase. We want the font to be extra bold. We also want it to be centered with text center. We're going to make it darker with text zinc 500. And we're also going to make the letter spacing a little bit wider with tracking wider. That looks right. It doesn't have the right spacing on the top and bottom of this section though. So let's see if we can add that into the section tag itself. So I'm going to say class name equals on my section and say py24 and see if that enables us to have the right spacing. It looks like it does for now. So we'll go ahead and leave that as is, and we'll go ahead and move on to our H1. For our H1, this is the main title of the page. We're going to say class name equals, that's going to be our font heading. To switch the font of that, we also want that to be font black for the 900 font weight. We'll want that to come up in size. So I'm going to say text 5XL if I'm not mistaken here. We're also going to say text center, and MT4 should add 16 pixels of margin on the top of that H1. That looks like it's matching our design right now. Let's go ahead and move on to our paragraph. So I'm going to say class name on our paragraph. We're of course going to center this as well. So text center, the text is going to be extra large. So text XL for that 20 pixel font size. We're going to ensure that it's moved down from the title with MT6. We also want the text to be a little bit darker. So we'll say text zinc 400, and that'll make it a little bit darker. That looks like it matches the design. So moving on to our cut corner button, let's go ahead and add some classes onto this. So class name equals, we'll first ensure that it's flexed to the center of the page. So we'll want to add a wrapper around it. So I'm going to say div here with a class name, and we'll say flex justify center, and that will enable that to be wrapped around our button, and then we can move that button to the center of the page with that. And we can also add the margin top to this as well to split it from the paragraph. So I'm going to say MT10, and that should give it enough spacing from the paragraph. And then for the actual image, this is going to be interesting because we're going to be doing a lot of positioning around this image. And of course, we're going to want to constrain eventually the width of this image and have all that working. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a div around it. So I'm going to say div class name equals, and this is going to be inline flex to ensure that it wraps around the image tightly. And that's also what's going to control my spacing here. So I'm going to add an MT24 to that to give that the 96 pixels of margin top there. Now that we have that image on the page, we can see that there is this other image that follows the shape exactly and sits below our regular icosahedron image that we have here, icosahedron shape. That's actually going to be the same exact image, but we're going to use some filters to bring down the color to match our zinc background. So we're going to do that by just bringing in another image tag. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. I'm gonna say img here. The source is gonna be exactly what we had before. So I'm just gonna copy and paste what that source was. Since it's a decorative image, we can set the alt to an empty string. And then of course, we're gonna go ahead and add a class name to this as well. So the class name is going to be absolute. You can see I'm putting it before my other image because I actually want this to be below the image that we see right here. So that's why I'm putting it before it. And this absolute positioned image is going to go ahead and have a width of, it's actually going to be calculated because of course we have our inline flexed relative container that's wrapping our normal image. We're going to calculate this width. So it's going to be calc 100% plus 100 pixels. And that's going to be how that width is going to be set. We're also going to need to take away their max width. So max width none, we'll take away that. And right now it's showing up above our normal image, even though it's below it in the direction that we have here. Let's go ahead and make this, first of all, let's make this relative to make our relative container. And we'll also go ahead and set our Z indexes so that we can drop this below. So I'm going to say Z0 here, and then this image is going to be negative Z10, and that's going to drop the bigger image below my smaller hero image. After that, we want to position it to the center of our image. So I'm going to do top 1/2, left 1/2, negative translate X 1/2, and negative translate Y 1/2. And that should position it directly behind our larger image. And then we just need to filter this so that it shows up as this kind of like dark shadow for our regular image. So I'm going to do that with saturation. So I'm going to saturate that to 10%. And then I'm also going to turn down the brightness. So the brightness is going to go to 4%. And let's save that and see what that looks like. And that looks like it's almost perfect. It looks like there's just a little bit difference in hue. So we're actually going to do a hue rotate in order to change the hue of it as well. So I'm going to say hue rotate 240 degrees, and that should just change the color of that just slightly. So this is essentially what's making this like dark, almost black color, is these filters that we're adding, but it's actually just this same image duplicated behind my normal hero image. Now that we have that done, let's go ahead and see if our design is matching what we've done over on our page. So I'm going to not worry about these lines yet because we're not seeing enough of the screen in order for us to really worry about where those lines are being placed. So without worrying about those, let's go ahead and overlay our design on top of our page, and let's see if we're getting this to be exactly aligned. So I can see that, yes, for our hero part of the page, we're definitely getting that to be aligned. As we scroll down, we can see that the image looks like it's perfectly aligned as well. So that looks right. Let me go ahead and pull back out my reference image to a side-by-side, and that means we can move on to our tablet view. Before we move on to our tablet view though, one of the things that I'm seeing is I'm seeing this horizontal overflow detected. And anytime I see this icon, that means we have the ability to left and right scroll, which is definitely going to mess up the design of our page. And it's certainly not something we are wanting to allow to happen because we're not trying to give the user the ability to left and right scroll here. So in order to change that, all I need to do is come up to my section. I need to say overflow X clip, and that should ensure that we don't have any overflow showing on the left and right sides of the page. Now I use overflow clip instead of hidden because overflow hidden will stop my top and bottom overflow from happening as well. I actually want to keep that because as you can see in my design, I have some of my top content overflowing this section. And as I move down on my page, there's actually, you can't see it right now, but as we were looking at the design, you could see that this was also overlapping the next section of the page. So I want to keep my top and bottom overflow on the page, but I want to remove my left and right overflow, which is what just happened. I'm not seeing that icon anymore, which means we're good to go. Let's move over to the tablet view of this page, and it looks like we definitely have some changes on the tablet view. So I'm going to close down my sidebar so we can get a better view of the code. I'm going to pull out my tablet view just a bit so that we can start to see some of the design beside it, and then we'll go ahead and dive into what we need to do in order to make this perfect to the design. As we can see, as we get into the tablet view, we do have some changes to a few things. One of the things is the font size of the title. That definitely comes up. So that's a bigger font size. The description also changes font size. That comes up as well. And there's definitely more space in between the top of the hero and the header as well. We also see that the image is constrained in size. So we'll want to make sure that we do that as we're going through and making these changes. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and start probably by just changing our font size. So I'm going to come down into my H1, and I think in the medium size, I'm going to add that medium modifier. I'm going to say text 6XL to bring that up one size and see how that looks. That looks much closer, so I think that's right. And then for our paragraph, we'll also want to bring that up as well. So that was text XL. Well, now in the medium size, it's going to be text 2XL, and that's going to make that bigger as well. It looks like we have some constraint of the size, so I'm not seeing this changing, but certainly our paragraph looks like it's constraining the width. So we'll want to make sure that we add that in. So what we're going to do is we're going to say max width extra large to give it that max width of 36 rems. And then to push that towards the center of the page, we'll just need to say MX auto, and that will push that towards the center of the page. I'm not seeing any other major changes to the size of the text. So let's see if we can get the spacing aligned as well. So I'm going to come up here to my section class name and say PY32 and give that a medium modifier as well. And that should start to push some of that down. Now that 32 doesn't look like it was quite enough. So let's see what 40 does, see if that's any closer. And then that looks like it's still not quite there. Just double checking. Let's see if 48 gets it down to the right spot. It looks like it does. I'm going to go ahead and overlay my reference image just so I can see if it's perfect, and maybe it's not quite there. So let's just even see if 52 does the trick. And it looks like 52 is the answer that we have. So 52 is a padding top and bottom of 208 pixels at the medium size. And that's really just to start to show the different items that start to appear, the 3D images that start to appear at the top and the bottom of this section. So this looks like it was the answer for the padding. Let's go ahead and move that reference image back out to the side so we can take a look at what else we need to do. If I come down to my image, I also know that my image is going to be constrained and come towards the center of the page. Now we already have this wrapped in an inline flex container, but an inline flex container, we can't really easily move that to the center of the page. So I'm going to wrap this in another div. I'm going to give that div a class name of flex and justify center. That should enable us to move that towards the center of the page. And then I'm going to change my MT24 to be on this outer flex container instead, and that should enable that to happen. Now I'm going to give my image a size here. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a class name. I'm going to say size 500 pixels. That'll give it a height and width of 500 pixels and bring it to the right size. This will still be wrapped around it. This will still be basing its width based on the image size that we have here. Now on the mobile view, when we come back, it's actually going to be smaller. We can see that we have some problems here because it's changing the height and width to 500 pixels. Now that's not quite what we wanted. Let's actually change this to width. Let's just change the width of our image and see if that does a better job of changing it. And it does, because this image has a max width of 100% that's brought in by Tailwind CSS. So as soon as that hits up against that max width, it's going to bring that width down proportionally, and it's going to change the height proportionally. If we change both, that's going to be a problem. But since we just changed one, that is going to leave it at the right size. And as you can see, when we look between the tablet view and our design, we see that those are lined up very nicely. So let's go ahead and overlay those again, just to double check that we have everything in place. And it looks like we do. I'm not going to worry about the outer design part, the hexagons and the other cubes and things like that, until we get to the desktop view, because that's really going to be the place where we can really see those changes as we make them. But for now, it looks like our tablet view is correct. So I'm going to go ahead and overlay that once again side by side and come over into our desktop view. Now that we're in the desktop view, let's see what changes we need to make here as well. So the first thing I'm noticing is that the title is definitely constrained in width as well. So we want to make sure that we add that in. Let's move up to the title and ensure that we have the right constraints here. So that would be a max width of 3XL. If I'm not mistaken, let me double check that. It looks like that's still a little large. So let's bring that down to 2XL and see if that's constraining it to the right size. It does look like it is, but the other thing that was changing was, of course, the font size. So at the large size, the text is going to be 7XL. That's going to bring that up, and that actually may have made sure that that 3XL width was actually constraining it correctly, and it does look like it was. Either one of those would work. So we'll just stick with this one, and we can also say MX Auto to bring it back towards the center of the page, and we see that that looks right. Before we move on to creating all of our 3D shapes and hexagons and things that we want to do there, let's go ahead and see if we have anything else that is misaligned with our design. So I'm going to overlay my design once again and just scroll down here, and I don't see anything else that's misaligned right now, which means that we can move on to creating some of our absolute position shapes that we see in this section. In order to do that, the first thing we'll need to do is add these hexagons that we see right here. So we see these big, large hexagons are actually absolutely positioned to our image. So they're going to be basing the center of the hexagon based on where the center of this image is, which means we need to put these inside of this relative container in order to get that to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and create my first div for that. I'm going to say div class name equals. Since we want to push these directly to the center, we're going to say absolute left 1/2, top 1/2, and then negative translate x 1/2 and negative translate y 1/2. And that should push that towards the center of that image. Now the actual hexagon itself is an SVG that we need to drop on our page. So I'm going to go to our sidebar and we're going to go find inside of our public assets images, we're going to go find that hexagon.svg. And we actually want to copy and paste this because we want to be able to control the styles that this hexagon has. So I'm going to close that hexagon out now that I've copied it, and I'm going to close my sidebar to give a little bit of room for my code. And then I'm going to drop that inside of that absolute position container that we just created. So paste that in there, and that should paste that hexagon in there. Now this hexagon, I don't think we're going to see it yet. And part of that is because it's positioned under our image. We need to make sure it's the right size. So I'm going to go ahead and add a class name to this one. And that class name is going to say size. And this first one is going to be 1100 pixels in size. And that's going to set the height and width of that to my 1100 pixels. So let me go ahead and pull out my design again so that we're not seeing the overlay design. Pull out these out side by side so that we can actually see what's changing as we go. We also want to make sure that this is set up to be JSX and not HTML with some of our attributes. So I'm going to say stroke width there. And we can see that right now we have a path and we have a fill, but there's nowhere that we're setting what the actual stroke color is. So we should say probably stroke equals current color. And then we can just set the current color of that. So I'm going to say text fuchsia 500, give that an opacity of 10%, and that should set that nice 10% opacity that we see. We also want to rotate this a little bit to the negative direction. So I'm going to say negative rotate 6, and then I'll rotate it 6 degrees to the left and just give us that nice hexagon look behind our icosahedron shape. Now, since we're going to be making a couple of these, but we're going to be changing these slightly, it might make sense for us to make a shared component for this hexagon that we have here. And that's definitely going to come in handy when we get to the part where we're animating these hexagons. So I'm actually going to take my SVG and just copy this code, open up my sidebar, and I'm going to go to components, and we're going to create a hexagon.tsx file. And let me go ahead and close up my sidebar again. I'm going to export const hexagon, and that's going to be equal to a component that returns some JSX. Now we already have that copied, so I'm just going to paste that JSX in here. And like our other component, I want to make our class name editable with Tailwind merge. So I'm going to import my Tailwind merge function, and then I'm going to come into my class name and say Tailwind merge here. And we're going to go ahead and put that in there. And we're going to take in the class name from this hexagon as well. So I'm going to say props. We're going to type this as component props without ref of an SVG. Anything we can pass to an SVG, we can pass into here. And we're going to pull out the class name from that. So I'm going to say const class name is equal to our props to pull out that class name. And then we can just drop our class name right at the end of here so that anything that our class name overrides from this initial list will be overridden. Now we don't want the size. The size is specific to our implementation of this particular one. So I'm definitely going to remove that for sure. We can leave the text fuchsia 500. I think that's going to be true of all of our hexagons that we create. And the negative rotate 6 is probably fine, although we can decide in the future if we want to remove that, we can certainly come back and do that. So I'm going to save this component that we currently have, and I'm going to come back into my hero.tsx, remove our SVG that we had, and I'm going to drop in our hexagon component, right like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and create a class name and drop in our size 1100 pixels because of course we need to make sure that it is the 1100 pixel size. Let's make sure that it was imported automatically, which it looks like it was when I pushed enter. So I'm going to save this, make sure it's still on our page in the right position, which looks like it is, which means that our hexagon component is now created accurately. Now that we have one of our hexagons created, let's go ahead and create another one by just copying and pasting this right here. So go ahead and copy and paste that, save it. Now it's overlaying our current one, but this one is going to be a different size. This one is going to be 1800 pixels. So let me go ahead and set that 1800 pixels and then scroll up, and we can see that this is now showing up here. So that's this large hexagon that we see surrounding this particular section. That's going to be this 1800 pixel one that we see right here. Now that we have our hexagons in place, let's see about bringing in our different 3D shapes that we're going to be showing within this section as well. So in order to do that, let me go ahead and create another absolutely positioned div. So div class name equals, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy what we have right here and just remove the hexagon because of course we're going to replace the hexagon with a different image, and we're going to go ahead and move around our image. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove the hexagon, but it is still going to be centered on this particular image itself as the basis for where we're going to be moving it to. So once we do that, let's go ahead and create another div around here, and I'm going to add in an image. That image source is going to be /assets/images, and I think we can go ahead and drop in our cube right now. So cube.png, and the alt tag will be cube 3D image, and then we'll just go ahead and close that image JSX tag. Now that image we can see is right here right now. Of course, that's not where we want it to be. So we need to position that. And we also want to wrap that in a circular div as well. So in order to accomplish both of those things, we need to go ahead and change the styles of this outer div. So let's say class name equals, and we'll say that this has a background of BG Zinc 900, the same as the background of the page. So that is laying beneath that. We'll also give this a set height and width with size. So I'm going to say size 240 pixels, and that'll create that size that we need here. Inside our cube is also going to be a different size. So I'm going to set the class name and say size 140 pixels, and that should bring that cube size down. And then we want this to also be inline flex. So inline flex items center justify center. We'll make sure that our cube sits in the middle of our new div. We'll say rounded full to make sure that it is a circle. And we'll also want to add a border to this as well. Now, the easiest way to add a border to this is not going to be a border itself, but it's going to be an outline because we want the border to sit inside our div, whereas regular borders sit outside. We want to be inside because that will help us control opacity and overlaps and things that would be a lot harder to deal with otherwise. So in this one, we'll say outline, and we'll say outline 6 pixels. We want to say negative outline offset 6 pixels. And let me show you actually why doing a negative offset here. So if I don't have that negative offset, let's go ahead and just remove that real quick and go ahead with our outline of 6 pixels. It's actually still going to be outside of our container. So we can see that if we go ahead and set the color. So say outline fuchsia 500/10, and that should set the color of it. And you can see that it's laying outside of our div. Well, we actually want it to be inside of our div, and that's why we say negative outline offset, and then we give it the 6 pixels as well, because that brings it into our div and actually pulls that border inside. Now that we have this div styled correctly, now we just need to position it correctly, and that's going to be with this same div right here. So we're going to make sure that it is absolutely positioned by saying absolute, and then we are going to change the top and left. So I'm going to say left is going to be 200 pixels from the left, and then the top is going to be negative top 900 pixels, and that should bring it all the way to the top where we want to see it, right up here. And that does look like it does the trick, which means that we now have our cube in place, and it's time to move on to our cuboid and our torus. Let's go ahead and start with our cuboid. So I'm going to copy and paste what we just did right here and put it below. And we're just going to remove the left and top because we know that those aren't going to be equal to what we had for our cube. And we also want to change the cube to cuboid.png. We want to change the alternate alt tag to cuboid 3D image, and that should set us up to be able to style this up correctly. Now this cuboid is the same size, and it looks like it also has the same sized container around it, which is definitely helpful for us, but it's going to be positioned differently. So we're going to say left 200 pixels. So the left is actually the same, but then we need to position it from the top. So I'm going to say top 270 pixels, and that's going to position it down where it needs to be, down here in the right side of our icosahedron image. Now that I've copied this circle a couple of times, I don't love doing that because I am noticing a lot of copied and pasted code. Now our absolute position div, I think we kind of have to just leave it as it is because it's what's essentially just moving things to the center of our image. I don't think we want to worry about that one too much, but this circle that we're seeing over and over, we certainly could make it its own component. So let me go ahead and copy this div right here, and let's bring out our sidebar and see if we can add this as a reusable component. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this circle.tsx, and we're going to create our custom circle component. So I'm going to say export const circle equals some props and return some JSX, and I'm just going to paste the div that I had copied from my hero. Now we need to bring in some props, and we know that our props are going to be typed component props without ref of a div. So anything you can pass to a div, we can pass into this one since we're not adding any custom props at this point. And we also want to make sure that we can create a custom class name on this as well, because of course the size is not always necessarily going to be the same size. And of course we want to be able to add on left and top and all of that. So let's go ahead and save this. We go ahead and word wrap this as well by going ahead and doing that. And then we'll make sure that we have a couple of props brought in here. So we want to say to bring out the class name prop as well as the children prop from our props that we're bringing into this component. We're going to drop our children in here, and we're going to use TW merge once again by importing TW merge from Tailwind merge, and then we'll just drop this right in here. So TW merge, and go ahead and bring this over. Let's go and end that function right there. Save that, and then add on our class name. So whatever we pass in as our class name could override any of these classes right here if we want them to. So that's the important reason that we use TW merge, especially for components. It's very, very helpful for using Tailwind to use that TW merge function. Now that I've done that, let me pull out the specific things that I'm adding for this specific circle. So I have left and top, those are definitely specific. So I'm going to cut those out right here. And I think absolute positioning is probably something that we don't automatically want. So I'm actually going to pull absolute position out as well and just leave everything else in here. So we have our background itself, that's fine. Our size, we'll leave this as the default. It could be overridden by our Tailwind merge function if we wanted to. Inline flex items, justify center, rounded full, our outline. All of those are going to be our default class names that we're going to give this circle. So I'm going to save that, come back to my hero, and go ahead and use my new circle component. So I'm going to go ahead and replace this with circle, and just go ahead and hit enter. It should import it, give this a class name, and that class name, I saved these because of course I want to use them. So I'm going to cut these, paste them into my class name. So it's going to be absolute left 200, top 270, and then I'm just going to wrap my image with this circle component. So I have my absolute position centering div. I have my circle, which has the size, absolute left and top, and then of course the image itself inside of that. So I'm gonna go ahead and save that and see if things change. If nothing changes, that means we've done it correctly because of course we were just replacing this and refactoring our code with a reusable component. Now that we've done that, that means we can also refactor this with that same reusable component. So I'm gonna wrap this in circle, my circle component. I'm going to change this to be wrapped here. And then of course I want to go ahead and take these class names out here. I'm going to remove this div. So let's go ahead and come over here and remove the rest of this div. Now that we've copied and pasted those classes, go ahead and paste those in here. There we go. Remove this ending div, and now TypeScript should be happy. And we have a much easier to see, easier to reason about piece of code here because we can see what's going on. So absolute, circle, image. The same thing here, our positioning div, our circle, and our image. So both of those are there. And if we can see, those look like they're both in place correctly. So I think I'm seeing those correctly. So those are looking good. Now it's time to move on to creating our torus image over here. And we can use the same reusable component. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this right here. We have a circle. I'm going to take off the left and top because those values are going to change. And of course, I'm going to change this. I believe it's torus.png, but I'll double check. So it looks like that was right. I'm going to change this to torus 3D image. I believe the size stays the same on our torus, but of course what changes is the positioning of it. So in that case, we have a negative left value of 600 pixels, and we have a negative top value of 80 pixels. And those are custom Tailwind CSS values. That's why I'm using those brackets there. And that should put that torus in the right spot over here. It looks like our header is complete. I am seeing a little bit of overlap from our sticky header, and I'm seeing my cube come over top of it. Of course, our header should always come over top of our hero section. So let's go back and double check that our header is set up correctly to do that. So I'm going to come back into my header section. I'm going to close my sidebar so we can look at this again. And it looks like we need to add a Z index to this. So it's sticky, but we need a Z index that's going to work for us. So let's just go ahead and add a Z index of 40 by saying Z40. And that should still allow us within Tailwind CSS to overlap something on top of it if we need to, but it's still a pretty high Z index for what we normally do. So let me go ahead and scroll down here. And now you can see that the header is overlapping all of our content, which is exactly what we want. Okay, let's double check that everything looks correct. I'm going to bring out my browser window again, and I'm going to overlap my reference image on top of my current page. And as I scroll down, you can see that everything is looking like it's aligning perfectly. The only thing I actually forgot was this scroll to learn more. That's the main difference right now from my design to my actual page. So we need to go ahead and add this scroll to learn more. So I'm going to pull out my reference image once again to my side-by-side, and let's go back to my hero section and see if we can add that particular content. I close my header.tsx, close my circle, close my hexagon, and just come into my hero. So I'm going to scroll down. We know that the cut corner button is above the image. We know that this is the flex container that is holding our icosahedron image right now. So it needs to come below that particular div. In order to create that, let's create a wrapping div that we can use to position it with. And we'll also create the mouse image. So I'm going to give this a div as well. And inside, of course, is going to be our little button. So that's going to be a div. So we're going to use styles to style those up. And then we're going to have a paragraph that's just going to say scroll to learn more. And that should enable the content for that. Let me scroll down to see where that is being placed right now. It might be on the left. Yes, it's over here on the left right now. So we need to justify to that to the center. So I'm going to say class name here, say flex justify center to justify our content to the center. And I'll go ahead and flex this to the column direction. So flex call, which actually means we're going to need to use items center instead of justify center, although we can still leave that justify center there if we want to. And we also want to make sure that this is split from our content. So I'm going to say MT40 to split it down from our content. The medium size is actually going to have that modified. So at the medium size is going to be MT80, and that's going to push it down even more once it gets up to that size, which of course we're working at the desktop size right now. So this is going to come into effect. Between our mouse and our paragraph, we're going to have a little bit of a gap, but we can't see that yet because we haven't created our mouse yet. Let's go ahead and create our mouse. So this is a class name here. This is going to have a height of 40 pixels, a width of 20 pixels with W5. And we're also going to give this that same outline effect that we've been using. So I'm going to say outline 6 pixels. We're going to say outline fuchsia 500/10 to give it that nice light fuchsia color. And we're actually going to leave our outline to the outside of this particular div. So in this case, we could have used a border, but we'll still keep it as the outline. And then we'll say inline flex rounded full to create our border radius the way that we want it. and then we can work on our little mouse button here. So for our mouse button, we're going to say class name equals, and this is going to be a height of 12 pixels and a width of 4 pixels. And then we're just going to give this a background of our fuchsia 500. We want to say this is rounded full to give that the border radius of the 9999 pixels. And we also want this to be positioned towards the center. So for this inline flexed div, we're going to go ahead and say justify center. And then we're also going to give it some top padding. We'll say PT2 to give it 8 pixels of top padding. That should position our mouse button exactly where we want it to be. Now that we can see where our mouse is at and where our text is at, we can give this a gap to just split these. And we'll say gap 4 to split these by 16 pixels. And that should split those correctly. And then our text is going to be similar to our eyebrow. So we're going to say class name equals, and that's going to be uppercase. We're going to give that a color of text zinc 500 to make it a little bit less obvious on the screen. We don't want it to draw as much attention. We're going to give it a font extra bold to change the font weight to 800. And then we also want tracking wider, and that's going to split our letter spacing a little bit. Now that should be how the design is created. So let me go ahead and pull back out my browser window and let's see if we have things created correctly. And I'm also going to overlay my design on top and scroll up and down a little bit to get those aligned. And it looks like that is pixel perfect to the design. Everything looks like it matches perfectly. So I'm going to pull this out side by side and then just double check on my other views as well that everything looks right. So definitely looks right on my tablet. And as I scroll down to my mobile, we can see that everything is still looking right here. So I think we're set on this section from everything to the mobile up through the tablet and the desktop view. And you can see that now that we've added our hexagons and our other images here, we can see that those are aligning as well. So we come to our tablet view, we can see that our hexagons are aligning. We can see all the images that we can see on our tablet reference image. And then as we come over to our mobile view, we can also see that we still see a little bit of that hexagon on the top and bottom. Of course, we don't see any of those other 3D images, but of course, there's just not enough real estate in the mobile view to be able to see some of those things. So everything looks right. I think we're done with our static hero section now, which means that we can move on to the next section. Moving into the next section, let's go ahead and scroll down and see what we're going to create next. So this is going to be a features slider where we're actually going to see a few different cards here that someone can slide between. And we're going to add some really nice hover effects to this as well. So we can see that there's a shape with a little bit of a shadow. We're going to do some things with that. We're also going to do some things with this cut corner card. So we're going to take some similar things that we did with our cut corner button, and we're going to match this with this cut corner card. And we're also going to change some things down here as we hover as well. So that's what's going to be happening on the mobile view. On the tablet view, let's come over and see what this looks like over here. And we can see that we start to see some of those cards. They get a little bit bigger. The text gets a little bit bigger for the hero here. The text gets a little bit bigger for the section title here. And of course, our cards have a little bit more room to breathe. And then on the desktop view, it gets even better with the amount of cards you can see. And of course, the text, the title for this section is getting even larger as well. So we'll make sure and account for all of those as we create this component. This is going to be a lot of fun in this section. Let's go ahead and dive into the code. In order to create that next section, let's go into our sections directory and create a new file in here. And we're going to call this features cards.tsx. And inside that features cards section, let's go ahead and export some JSX. I'm going to export const features cards section, and that's going to be equal to a component that returns some JSX. And for now, we can just say features cards section inside of that, just to make sure we have everything hooked up correctly. Now we're not going to see anything yet because we haven't dropped it into our page. So let's go into our pages and inside of our index.astro, and then we're going to go ahead and import this. So import features cards section from /sections/features cards. And in that, we'll go ahead and drop that below our hero section. So features cards section, that's going to be the component that we're going to drop in there. And as soon as we do that, we should be able to scroll down and see we have the features card section text, which we do, means everything's linked up correctly inside of our index page. So let me go ahead and close down our index page and go back to our features card sections where we'll go ahead and create the content for this section. To start with, let's go ahead and remove our H1 and create a semantic section tag. And inside that section tag, we're going to have a div class name of container, just holding our content away from the edges of the page. Inside of that div, we want an H2 for the title. And that's going to say, discover the future of blockchain with Blockforge. That's going to be our title. And then below that, we're going to have our cards. In order to create these cards, let's go ahead and wrap a div around each of our cards. And of course, we're going to have a div for our first card. Now we're going to go ahead and create this as a normal div, and then we'll probably go ahead and change this over to a reusable component once we have this first card styled up. So let's take a look at what we need inside of our first card. We know that we're going to need a wrapping div. Inside of that, we're going to have some sort of title here. I'm just going to make that a semantic H3. I'm going to say revolutionary blockchain API. That's going to be the title for that. Then we're going to have some sort of text. So effortlessly integrate and manage blockchain data with our cutting edge API designed for seamless connectivity. And then below that paragraph, we can see that we're also going to have this learn more with an arrow SVG. So let me go ahead and create those two things, div class name equals, and we know that's going to be flexed. And below that, we can create our button that's just going to say learn more. And that's just for a semantic button tag here. And then we know that we also need our arrow icon. For our arrow icon, I'm actually going to pull in one of my favorite icon libraries, which is Heroicons. And that's what we're going to use to grab our arrow here. So let me go ahead and actually pull that up by pulling up my bottom panel and go to browse. And then I'm just going to search for Heroicons and go ahead and go to that Heroicons site and find the icon that I need. Now in this case, I'm going to use the arrow right. So I'm just going to search for arrow and I'm going to find the right one. That's going to be this long right here. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy the JSX for this arrow icon, and then I can drop it right into the code of my page. And I'm going to copy the JSX because of course we are creating a React JSX component. With that, let me go ahead and close that browse window and come back into my component. Let me save and refresh to make sure nothing has changed here. And we need to go back to make sure that I was on the right spot here. And I can see that that SVG has been dropped in for me. So let's make sure we have all of our content. We don't yet have our image. So let's go ahead and pull that in. I'm going to create an image tag with a source of /assets/images/pill.png. And we can give it an alt of pill image. And then we just want a self-closing image tag there for JSX. And as we scroll up, we can see that we do have that pill image there. The last part of our feature card section is going to be these dots down at the bottom. So we need to make sure that those are under our cards. So I'm going to fold this up and then I'm just going to create another div down here. This is going to be div. And for the dots themselves, of course, we need to create those along with a container to hold them. So this is going to be the container that holds them. And then of course, we're going to have our individual dots. I'm just going to create this 4 times, or in fact, I can go ahead and map over that. So we're not creating these 4 times, but just creating it once and then mapping over it 4 times. So I'm going to create a new array with a length of 4. I'm going to fill that with a dummy value and then just map over it. And for each one of those items, we can pull the index out and then just map over that div. And we're just pulling the index out because we need a key to keep React happy. So key equals I for the index of that array, and that should create those 4 divs there. Now to be able to see those, we of course need to be able to style them up. So we're going to give each of those a class name, and that's going to be size 2.5 to make them 10 pixels tall, 10 pixels wide. We're going to give this a background of zinc 500 to give them that colored background that we need. They're going to be rounded full. And when someone hovers over them, we're also going to say cursor pointer just to make it look more like a button. And then the wrapping div is also going to have a class name, and we're going to give this a BG zinc 950. And of course, we want this to be inline flexed as well to make sure that we're showing these buttons left to right. We'll go ahead and give this a gap of 4 to give it the 16 pixels of gap in between. And we'll also give this some padding of 2.5 as well to give it 10 pixels of padding. We'll say rounded full to make sure that the border radius is rounded. And then for the div outside of this, we'll go ahead and give this a class name of flex and justify center to push that towards the center of the page. And we'll come back and give that the margin once we style up the rest of this section. Now that we have all of our content on this section, let's go ahead and start our styling. So the first thing we'll do is create our H2 styling. So I'm going to give this a class name, and we're going to say font heading to make sure it's the right font. We'll say font black to make sure it's the right weight. And I believe this is going to be text 4XL if I'm not mistaken, which it looks like is correct. And then text center should move it towards the center of the page. Right now, this section does not have any padding, and we're definitely seeing the overlap between this section and our hero. So we need to give this a little bit of padding as well. So it looks like the padding for this is going to be the PY24. So I'm going to say class name on our section, and I'm just going to give it PY24, and we'll see if that works as our padding. It looks like it's side by side right now, which is definitely encouraging as we look at this section. Let's just double check and make sure that our title matches up by going ahead and overlaying the reference image and giving it a little bit of scroll. So yes, it looks like it is lined up correctly. So let's go ahead and pull that back and then work on our card. Moving into our card, that's going to be this div right here. We're going to need to think a little bit about this, because what I'm seeing is we're seeing this overlaid kind of background here. And of course we have this cut corner, which to me means we're going to need to mask the background separately from the rest of the card. So I'm actually going to need to create an absolutely positioned div below my card in order to create my background. So I'm going to give this a class name of relative just to be able to hold in whatever we create. And then I'm going to have a div for the background, give that a class name of absolute. And we're going to make this the size of the card. So just to say inset 0, that should make it full height and width of the card. We also want to give this a background of zinc 800, I believe should be the right background color. And let's just save that and see if that is correct. And it looks like it is, but of course we need to pull it down below the contents. So I'm going to give this relative div a z index of 0, and then I'm going to give the absolute div a z index or negative z index of 10. That should pull it below our card content. The other thing we want to do to the background is go ahead and make sure that it has the right border radius. So we're going to say rounded 2XL, and that should give that a border radius. And then of course we want to cut away one of those corners. So let's go ahead and do that the same way we did our cut corner button. So I'm going to say mask image, and we're going to say linear gradient, 225 degrees to have it come from that top right corner. And then we're going to go from transparent to transparent at 40 pixels. To black at 40 pixels, and that should wrap up the mask image that we need in order to cut that corner away, which of course we're doing right here. In order to see our code better, let's go ahead and close down our sidebar and go ahead and wrap our code so that we can see all of our class names in one spot. So this is the background right now, that cut corner background. Now below that background, we need this little bit of this peaking like light out here to the right. So in order to create that, we need another absolutely positioned element. So let's go ahead and create that. I'm going to div class name equals absolute. This one's actually going to have a size. So we're going to give it a height and width of 64 pixels by saying size 16. And we also want to make sure that it has rounded corners. So I'm going to say rounded XL. And just for this card, we'll go ahead and make it the color that we want. But of course, we know that in the future, we're going to change this. So I'm going to say BG fuchsia 500, and that should give it the right background color. And then we know that we're going to want to position this to the top right. So we're going to say top 1.5 to actually pull it 6 pixels away from the top, and then right 1.5 to pull it 6 pixels away from the right to get it positioned in the right spot. Now we can make sure this is below our absolute position background by just saying negative Z10 as well. And since we've created this element below our absolute position background and gave it the same Z index, it should come below that background that we've already created. Now that we have that cut corner part of this card done, let's go ahead and move on to the content of the card. So in the content of the card, we can see that we have this H3 and paragraph that we still need to style, and we need to make sure that we have the proper amount of padding that we're seeing on our design. So we definitely have some padding around here that we're not accounting for yet. Let's first add the padding by coming into our card and saying P8. That should add the right amount of padding. And then let's move into our title for this card. So this one is going to say class name equals font heading to make sure it's the right font family, font black to make sure it's the right weight, text 3XL should make it the right size, and then MT12 should push it away from our image enough. And then coming down to our paragraph, let's go ahead and change the styles for that as well. So class name equals, we'll make it a little bit bigger with text large. We'll also make it the right color with text zinc 400, and we'll also push it down from our title with MT4. That should push that down. Now for our button and arrow, let's go ahead and make sure those have the right styles. So our button itself, we're going to say class name equals, and we're going to give it a text small to make sure that is small. We're going to say font heading to make it the enter font, and uppercase should make it uppercase. Font extra bold should make it the right weight, and then tracking wider should give it the right letter spacing to look correct. And of course, this one as well, we're going to say text fuchsia 500 to make it the right color. Moving to our arrow, there's a couple of things we're going to want to do here. So we're going to want to change the stroke width a little bit and bring that up. So the stroke width is going to be 2, and then we're also going to want to make the size a little bit bigger. So I'm going to say size 8 to bring that size up. We want to flex these between, so we don't want to justify between to make sure that these are on the right sides. So I'm going to come up into my wrapping div and say justify between and enable those to be justified between. And then we're going to want to add some top margin here as well. So that's going to be MT12 for the right top margin. We know that we want our image to be a little bit smaller than it currently is. We haven't done anything with the styles of the image. And this is actually a fun one because we also have to create our shadow, which we don't currently have yet. So let's go ahead and modify our image classes as well. So let's add a class name here, and we'll say size 40 to make it 160 width and height. And we also want to make sure that it's positioned in the center of our card. So I'm going to just give this a wrapping div here. For that div, we're going to add a class name, and that's going to be flex justify center, and that should push that towards the center of the page. And then we also want to bring this up and give this negative margin, because you can see that our image is actually overlaying the top of our card. So I'm going to say negative MT28 to give it negative 7 rems of margin from the top of our card. Now we also need to move our cards down a bit if that's the case. So let's make sure that's done with this outer div. I'm going to give this a class name as well. I'm just going to say MT36, and that should move our cards down and make sure they align with what we're seeing on our design. Right now, we're looking pretty good to our design. The extra spacing that we're seeing right here is just because these are being flexed, and so they're all taking up the same amount of space. So I'm not worried about this extra spacing on the bottom yet. What I am concerned about, there's a little bit of a color difference with our arrows. So let's go ahead and correct that very quickly by just saying text zinc 500, if I'm not mistaken. That should be the right color for our arrow. And then we also need to worry about this image shadow. So coming back up to our image, let's go ahead and see if we can create the right shadow here. In order to do that, let's go ahead and put an inline flexed div around our image so that we can contain it inside a container. So I'm going to say div class name equals inline flex. That should allow us to have a container that we can absolutely position elements from. And we're going to say relative because of course we want to contain any absolutely positioned elements inside this relative container. And then in that, I'm going to create an absolute position div, class name equals absolute to make sure it's absolutely positioned. We're going to give this a height of 16 pixels, and then the width is going to be the full width of our container. Let's go ahead and close that. And then from the top, we're going to calculate this to be the 100% of the height plus an extra 16 pixels. So I'm going to say top, and we're going to say calc 100% plus 16 pixels or 1 rem, and that should put it at the right spot. And then just to see this, let's go ahead and give this a background color of zinc 950 with 70% opacity, and that should give us that shadow that we're seeing right there. Now, of course, we want that to be perfectly rounded, and we want to make it look more like a shadow. And the way that we do that is we can't use rounded full, because rounded full will actually make it this like pill-like shape. That's not our intention. Our intention is to actually give it a rounded value of 100%. So I'm going to add a custom value of 100%, and that should give it the rounded value that we need. And then we can actually use an image mask to give us that kind of shadowy effect. So I'm going to say mask image, and we're going to use a radial gradient here. And inside the radial gradient, we're going to say closest side to get it to go from center to the closest side. And we're going to go from black to transparent. So nothing crazy there. We're just going to say basically show the full BG-Zinc 950/70 in the center and then go out towards transparent. And you can see that that creates that nice shadow effect that we see right here. Now let's go ahead and overlay our reference image to see if there's anything else we missed. I think the only other thing we would have missed would be this margin here. And of course we're seeing this first dot change, but we're going to take care of that when we create all of our cards. Plus when we animate them, then we can worry about which card is selected. So let me just go ahead and overlay my design on top and let's see if we missed anything here. And it looks like the one thing that's a little bit different is actually the width of our card. We didn't set a width. We actually allowed it to expand to the max width of the page, and that probably wasn't smart because we are going to have a few more cards lined up to the right. So that's what's, I think, creating this little bit of difference that you're seeing right here. So let's see if we can change that to set that up. So this is actually our card div right here. This is the container for our card. Let's see if we can just go ahead and give that a specific size. So I'm going to give that a max width of extra small in order to make sure that that is the size that it should be on the design. And that looks like it is correct now. Now this difference that you're seeing down here with the arrow is something that we're going to account for next, because we're going to do our hover effects and make sure that those are correct as well. So let me go ahead and bring the reference image back out to the right, and then we'll go ahead and talk about what different hover effects we want for this particular card. So there's actually going to be a couple of things that happen whenever a user hovers this card. The first thing is this image is going to pop up and it's going to just be translated in the Y direction. And then the shadow, because of the image is a little bit further up, is going to look like it fades a bit. So it looks like the image is actually popping off the card. It's a really cool effect. We'll talk through that. The other thing that's going to happen when someone hovers this card is that this light over here is going to start to glow. So we want this light to glow when someone hovers the card. And then this arrow is also going to change color and it's going to move a little bit as well. So those are the three things that are going to happen when someone hovers this card. Let's start with the image and then we'll move on to the light. So for our image, what we want to happen, let's go ahead and first create a group class. So in Tailwind CSS, when we use group, then whenever someone does something to that group, like let's say hovers it, we can change things inside of the card based on this group class. So we'll say right here, group hover. So whenever this card is hovered, here's what we want to change. In this case, we're going to say negative translate Y6. And we're also going to add a transition just to make this a smooth transition. So transition and duration 300 to have it happen over 300 milliseconds. So let's see what happens when we do that. And we can see that, yes, we are indeed moving that image. When we hover the card anywhere on the card, that image is going to change. That's all well and good, but of course we also want our shadow to change along with it. So we're going to add some changes here. So I'm going to say group hover. We're going to change the opacity of our shadow. So I'm going to say BG Zinc 950/30, and that's going to change the opacity as well. And of course we want this to transition as well. So I'm going to say transition and duration 300 to make it the same duration. So let's see how that looks when we hover our card. Yes, so now it looks like the shadow is getting smaller when the image is higher and darker when the image is lower. That creates a nice 3D effect. I love what's going on there. Let's move on to the light on the right side of our card. In order to create that light, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate our background here, our little fuchsia square that we have showing to the right of our card, and we're just going to blur it when we have the card being hovered. So I'm going to actually just duplicate this and put it right here. And for that, we're just going to say blur, and we're going to make sure that it's blurred large and save that. And you can see that creates that nice, almost lighted look. And of course, when it's lighted, we also want to change the color of our background as well to make it look like it's a little bit brighter. So we're going to say a couple of things. Number one, we're going to change the opacity of this when the card is hovered as well. So I'm going to say opacity is going to be 0 by default. And then when we hover with group hover, we'll say opacity is going to be 100. We also want to transition this as well. Transition duration 300. That should add our transition duration. So let's see if that turns on when we hover. And yes, we have that turning on. Now we just need to change the actual light as well. So I'm going to say group hover here, and then that's going to be BG Fuchsia 400 just to make it a little bit lighter. And we're going to do the same transition as well. So transition duration 300 should take care of that. So let's see what effect we've created now. That is impressive. We have this light coming on when we hover our card. We have this image coming up. The only last little bit we need to do is just to change this arrow a little bit as well. So let's scroll down to our arrow, which is going to be this SVG, and we can change it as well. So let's say group hover. One of the things we want to change is the text color. So we're going to bring it down probably to a white like the actual text of the card. So when we hover that, we're going to say text zinc 300. So let's see that that changes, and indeed it does. We also want to add a transition here. So say transition duration 300 to give it that duration of 300 milliseconds. And that adds a nice smooth effect rather than jerking from one state to the next. And the only other thing we want to do is go ahead and give it a little bit of translation as well. So by default, it's going to be translated to the negative X direction. So I'm going to say negative translate X, and I believe that's just going to be by 8 pixels. And then when we hover it, we're going to say group hover translate X0 to get it back in the right position. So it's going to be translated to the left, and then when we hover it, it should go to the right. So you can see there's just a little bit of an effect there as well. This is a really cool card, just a nice little micro interaction that really brings this card to life. So this is a great effect. Let's see what else we need to do in this section to finish this up. In order to finish up this section, one of the things we definitely need to do is have some more data for our cards. Now this wasn't included in this section, so we need to go ahead and create that data up top. So I'm going to say const card data, and that's going to be equal to an array, and we know we're going to have 4 of these cards. So I'm just going to go ahead and create 4 objects with commas in between, and that's going to ensure that we have those 4 objects. Now for each of those objects, we are going to have an image, a title, a description. Those are the things that are going to change, and of course we want to be able to set the card color as well. So I'm going to say image, and we're going to have a string here. The first one, we know we have our data already, so I can copy it from our first one. And the same thing is true of my other properties inside of this object. So I'm going to say title, and go ahead and create an empty string there, description, create an empty string there, and color, and create an empty string there. And then I'm just going to copy and paste what we already have for our first card. So we know that the image is going to be this assets/images/pill. So I'm going to drop that in there. The title is going to be this revolutionary blockchain API. That's going to be the title that we're going to drop in there. The description is going to be this paragraph text right here. And for the color, it has to be on one line. So let me go ahead and change that. And then for the color, we know that we're going to color this as fuchsia. So that's going to be the first card, but let's go ahead and fill in our other card data. And we could probably just go ahead and scroll over and at least see in our design on our last desktop, at least a couple of these cards. And then I can go ahead and fill this in as well with what's not shown. So image for our second one is going to be /assets/images/cuboid.png. The title, and let me make sure that's ended with the right quote right there. The title is going to be the decentralized data solutions. The description is going to be empower your applications with decentralized data solutions, ensuring security and transparency at every step. And then the color for that one is actually going to be lime. For our third card, we need to do the same thing. So we have image. Let me go ahead and create that with /assets/images/cone.png. The title for that one is going to be Next Gen Smart Contracts. The description for that one is going to be unlock the potential of next gen smart contracts with our robust and scalable API tailored for modern blockchain needs. And then the color for that third one is going to be cyan. And then for the fourth one, we want to do the same thing. So image is going to be /assets/images/icosahedron.png. That's going to be the same one we've used up at the top in our hero. The title is going to be seamless blockchain integration. The description is integrate blockchain technology seamlessly into your projects with minimal effort, if I can spell correctly, and maximum efficiency. And then the color for this one is going to be violet. Okay, so we have our 4 different cards in our card data array. That means we can then map over our cards. And instead of using these static sources and titles and descriptions, we can actually use a different one for each one. So we know that this relative div is our card div. So we'll just map over those here. So I'm going to say card data.map, and then we can go ahead and pull out the data itself. So we can pull out the image, the title, make sure I have my description and our color, and then go ahead and make sure it is showing some JSX here, and that's going to be this entire div. So I'm just going to fold this up and I cut and paste into here, and that's going to allow us to use the attributes of these objects as we pull them out. So of course we're going to first drop in the image, so that's going to go in here. So we're going to say that this source is going to be equal to image. This is going to be our title, so let's go and replace that with title. This is going to be our description right down here in our P, so let's go and replace that with the description. And we also have the button text, and we have color. So color is going to be a little bit harder. Let's go ahead and get to that in a second. We also want to make sure that we have the key properly set up. So let's go ahead and have the key equal to the title. That should be a unique string. That should work well for React. So let's go ahead and scroll back over, make sure I have the right thing down here. So as I scroll down, we should see that the cards are down here, but of course they're not aligned next to each other yet. And that's fine. We just need to make sure that we have a way to do that. And that's going to be with a couple of flexed containers. So we want to put 2 flexed containers around our cards in order to ensure that they are able to be flexed without changing the size of our cards themselves. So the first one is going to be this one that we already have. We're just going to say that this is flexed. And then the second one is going to be another div, which we're going to wrap around our card data. So let me fold that up for a second, just so we can see where the end of that is, and fold that back out. And this one's going to say class name equals flex, but then it's also going to say flex none, and that's going to ensure that they can each be sized according to their own size rather than Flexbox itself. And then between our cards, let's go ahead and scroll back down so we can make sure this is working, and it is. So between our cards, we definitely want a gap. So we'll say gap 8, that'll put a 32 pixel gap in between our cards. Now, on the mobile view, of course, we're not really able to see that second card yet. But of course, as we scroll over to some of our other views, we should be able to see the different cards. And I can actually scroll because we have some overflow that's happening that we need to cut off, but we can see all of our cards as we scroll over there. So let me go ahead and scroll back up, make sure my reference image is correct, and it looks like it is. So let's go ahead and make sure that our scroll isn't overflowing this container by just going ahead and adding overflow x clip. And that should ensure that we don't see any of the extra scroll side to side. That's just going to be controlled specifically with our dots. Now that we have all of our cards on the page, now we actually can see that our dots container and our card is the same size, which means we can now position our dots container as well. So let me go ahead and fold this cards div up, and let's look at this dots container for just a second to see if we can give it the proper margin. So let me try and give this a margin top of 10, which should be about 40 pixels. And let's see if that is in line with what we have in our design. So I'm going to just go ahead and overlay our reference image once again and give it a little bit of a scroll to make sure that it is aligned. And it looks like it is. I'm actually hovering. It's showing me something different, but if I'm not hovering, it looks like everything is aligned perfectly. So I'm going to go ahead and put that out back side to side and see if there's any other updates we can make. Now, right now, we're not seeing any other of our cards, so it's kind of hard for us to adjust colors from our mobile view. Since we know that our mobile view should be working well, let's go ahead and move on to our tablet view and see what changes we need to make over there, and then we can start to adapt the different colors that we have here as well. Before we do that, one other thing that I realized is that now that we have card data, we don't need a dummy array for our dots either. We can actually use the card data array and the length of it to be able to map over and have a dot for each one of our cards. So I'm going to change this new array 4 with this fill. I'm just going to change this to card data dot map. And then I also don't want to just use the index anymore. I can actually use the card data itself. So let's just go ahead and pull out the title and use that same thing as the key here. And that should allow us to do that. And if we need to come back and use that index, we can, but I just thought that was more appropriate for that section. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. We should see the same number of dots. That's all working well. Moving over to our tablet view, let's go ahead and pull out our browser window just a little bit to be able to see this based on our design. We can see that we have a couple of changes. It looks like the padding on this card might be changing a little bit from what I'm seeing over here on my actual page. And of course the width is definitely changing. So we want to account for both of those things. The title of this section is changing as well. So we want to make sure we account for the title change there. And it looks like we may even have a little bit of a change. We might have actually reduced the padding to the top of this section in this particular part of the page. So we'll make sure we have all that accounted for in this section. So let's go ahead and first worry about our title. When we go over to the medium view, we're going to add a medium modifier. We're going to say text 5XL. That should change the title text to be the right size, which it does. We also want to change our card width. So let's come down into here and let's see what we currently have. We currently have this max width extra small class added. That looks like it's going to go to a max width medium. So we're going to say at the medium size, we're going to say max width medium, and that should make our cards wide enough. Now I do once again see that there's a little bit of a padding difference here, and we can probably just account for that with a little bit of negative margin on the top. So let's see if we can do that. Let's see, negative MT, and let's start with 24 and see what that does. Looks like it's about correct. So let's go ahead and overlay a reference image and see how far off we were. It looks like that might need to be a little bit more. So let's try negative MT28 and see if that is accurate. And it looks like it is, but the padding of our cards is still causing these cards to look misaligned as well. So we definitely want to go ahead and change that as well. So come back side by side and let's go ahead and change the padding of our cards. This padding is currently P8. At the medium size, we want that to be P10. So I'm going to say medium modifier, P10 for 40 pixels of padding. And that should increase the size of those a little bit. And let me go ahead and overlay our reference image again and see if we have those lined up perfectly. It looks like we do, which means that on the tablet view, at least, we have those cards working well. We still haven't changed our colors. We'll do that when we get over to the desktop size because I think that's going to be the best place to be able to see that. So let's go ahead over to our desktop view, and I'm going to go ahead and pull this reference image out side by side once again. After I do that, let's go ahead over to the desktop view. And here we can see two complete cards, which is going to allow us to make sure that we can align our colors well to ensure that we can change the color in our cards based on what our data currently says. So let's see if there's any other differences. I definitely see a font size difference in the title. There may be a little bit of difference in the margin top of these cards as well, so I'll pay attention to that. But let's first change the font size of the title at this view and see if that helps. So we currently have text 5XL. Let's say on the large size, text 6XL, and see if that gives us the size that we need. And it looks like it does. As I scroll over, I do see that the text seems to be the same size now, although there's definitely still a margin difference between the cards themselves and the title of this section. So let's see if we can handle that as well. I'm going to go ahead and overlay for my reference image on top of my page and see if that can help us to create some of that alignment. So it looks like right now we have MT36 for our cards as spacing. So at the large size, we want to make that, let's try MT40 and see if that gets any closer. And let's go ahead and scroll a little bit. It is closer. Let's try 48 and see if that gets us there. So that looks like, as I scroll through, that looks like that is the ticket right there, the MT48. So that looks like that is exactly aligned with the design. The last thing we need to do in this particular section is we need to go ahead and make sure that we have the ability to change the color of our cards based on the data array that gets passed in. So let's go ahead and go to the top, and you can see that the first one is fuchsia, then lime, then cyan and violet. And we'd like to be able to change not only the light that's showing over here, but we'd also like to be able to change the button color over here as well. So let's go and pull over our code a little bit more just to give us a little bit more room to breathe, and then we'll look at how we can make that shift. So we know that our lights on the side of the card, our quote unquote lights, will need to shift. So we can use TW merge, that functionality, in order to change the background based on what color we pass in here. So let's see if we've imported that. It doesn't look like we have yet. So I'm going to go to the top of my file and I'm going to say import TW merge from Tailwind merge, and then we can come down into our card data and go ahead and change this class name here to say TW merge. And we're just going to wrap the entire classes that we have right now. And then we're going to say if the color is equal to lime, for example, then we're going to want the class name to be added to this to be BG lime 500. And let me go ahead and save that. And let's see if we can scroll over and see that happening yet. So if I hover this, I can see a little bit of lime there. And of course, we want to change the actual light color as well. So I'm going to go ahead and give this second one a TW merge function as well. And I'm going to wrap the entire class name that we have right now. And then I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to say color equals lime and BG lime 500. And of course, the other thing that changes on this one is our group hover. So we also want to say group hover and then BG lime 400. And that should shift that. So now we see that we have a lime light over here. The other thing we have to change is the button, of course. So let's go ahead down to our button and make sure that that's shifted as well. So I'm going to say the same thing here. I'm going to say TW merge, and I'm going to wrap the entire class name with that. And then I'm going to say color equals lime and text lime 500. And that should change that color over as well. So now we have a way to change our colors. Now we just need to add in the other colors as well. So we have fuchsia, we have lime, we also need to add in cyan and violet. So I'm going to come to the same spots where I did this before, and I'm just going to update these as well. So I'm going to say that if we have cyan, we're going to say BG cyan 500 there. And then same thing down here as I copy and paste this and make sure I have the right, there we go, color equals cyan. We're going to make the BG cyan 500, and the group hover is going to be BG cyan 400. And then same thing for our button. We can just go ahead and copy and paste this one, and we'll say if it's cyan, we switch this to text cyan 500. Now, why do we not make this dynamic is a really good question. Like, why don't we just say we're going to make it text dash and then fill this color in with some kind of a dynamic value and then have a 500 here? And that's because Tailwind is a build time tool, which means we have to be able to pre-populate. It has to be able to know every single value or every single class that it's going to need to create for its just-in-time compilation. So essentially, we need to be able to tell it specifically what classes are going to be available to us. We could potentially do that with a CSS custom property. We could adjust it that way. But since we're only working with a couple of different colors here, I think it makes more sense to just go ahead and spell this out and say, okay, if the color is lime, this is how we're going to adjust our button. This is how we're going to adjust our light, those kinds of things. They just make it a little bit easier to reason about. So that's why we go ahead and fill this out for every single color. Now, if we were dealing with, 20 or 100 different colors, we'd probably approach this a little bit differently. But since we're only dealing with 4, and we should be dealing with probably 4 for the entirety of the page, that's not too much hassle to go ahead and do it this way. And so the last color we need to fill in is our violet, I believe. Let me just double check, go to the top here, color equals violet. Yes, that's correct. So I'll fill in color equals violet. And of course, when that's the case, we are going to have the BG violet 500. And the same thing is true down here. We're going to go ahead and fill this one in and say when it's violet, we're going to change these to BG violet 500 and group hover BG violet 400. And down in our button, we'll do the same thing. So color equals violet, then we'll change the text to violet 500. Okay, so right now it's kind of hard for us to be able to actually see these third and fourth cards. One thing we could potentially do is just go ahead and add an overflow scroll onto the flexed box that holds our cards. That should be this one right here. Let's see if we can do that. If we say overflow X scroll, and let's see if it actually allows us to go ahead and scroll this. And it does look like it does. It does cut off our shapes and images that are outside the cards, but at least we can get an idea of what this looks like for each of these particular cards. And of course, it cuts off a little bit of our shadow as well. So we're not going to keep this on here, but it's good to just be able to see these different colors and see what's actually changing here. So I'm going to take that overflow X scroll off. That was just for us to be able to see that we had everything filled in correctly. And now that should allow our cards to repopulate the way that they were. With that, let me just take one more look at this section and ensure everything looks good across every responsive view. So we can see that on desktop, this section looks great. We see that it looks perfect along with the design. As we scroll over to our tablet view, we can see that everything is looking good to me as well. We're seeing the different colors for our cards and buttons over here. And then of course on mobile, we're also seeing everything looking good here, although it looks like we are seeing a little bit of a change in our margin top at this view. So we want to make sure we didn't adjust anything poorly here. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my browser back in so that we can take one more look at our code and ensure we don't have anything messed up here. So it looks like this would be the problem, or excuse me, this would be the problem up here, our negative MT28. I believe that took effect at the medium size screen, but we didn't add that medium modifier. So let's say if we can add the medium modifier and get that to only take effect at the medium screen. So now I'm seeing that my design is aligned with my page, and let's double check our tablet view as well. So that looks good across there. And then of course on desktop, it looks good across there as well. Okay, so coming back all the way over to our mobile view, everything looks great in this section. Looks like everything is aligned with our design, which means it's time to move on to the next section of the page. Moving down below our feature cards, we get to a feature grid. So this is actually what looks like a couple of sections that we're going to combine into a single section that just has some information and some calls to action about this blockchain company. So we have a title, description, a couple of list items that we're going to style up. And of course, we're seeing some similar buttons as we have created in our page already that we can go ahead and drop in. And then the second one is also going to have that same sort of layout. Now, as we move into our tablet view, this section gets a lot more interesting because that's when we start to actually bring in our 3D shapes alongside this section. Then of course, we're going to give a parallax effect too when we come back and do our animations. So this is going to make this section a lot more interesting once we're here. And then of course in desktop, we really get the full effect of those 3D shapes. Those are going to be front and center for this section. So this is going to be a good section to get some practice with CSS grid and things like that. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into the code. Back in our code, let's open up our source directory and go to sections and create a new features grid. So I'm going to create a new file that's going to be called featuresgrid.tsx. And inside that, we're just going to make it a React component. So I'm going to export const features grid, and that's going to be equal to a function that returns some JSX. For now, we're just going to return a div that says features grid, like so. And then we are going to wire it up into our page. So if I go into source/pages and go into my index page, I want to import this features grid section. So import features grid from /sections/features grid. And then I'm going to drop it below my features cards section. So I'm going to drop it right here. So features grid. And once we hit save, hopefully we'll see some text show up below our features cards. And it looks like we do see that features grid text showing up right here, which means it's correctly wired up into our page. Let's go ahead and close our index page and go back into our features grid and start filling out the content for this particular section. I'm going to erase what I put here and start out with a semantic section tag. That section tag is going to contain a container, as is normally the case with any of our sections. So I'm going to give this a class of container. And then inside that, we are going to go ahead and start to create the text. So we're going to start with an H2, and that's going to say empowering the future of blockchain. And then the paragraph below it is going to say Blockforge provides robust and secure infrastructure to support the next generation of decentralized applications. That's the paragraph below it. And then I also want to go ahead and make sure that we have word wrap toggled on so we can see all of our content. And I'm going to close my sidebar as well so that we can just give the code a little more space. And then below that, we have unordered list. So that UL is going to have some list items. Since I don't want to repeat myself on these list items with my styles, I'm going to go ahead and create the list items above it and just give it a constant of list items and then create that array. And that's just going to be an array of strings. So the first string is going to be experience unparalleled security and scalability. The second string is going to be fully benefit from scalable network effects. And the third string is going to be unlock the potential of decentralized networks. And those list items should allow us to go ahead and come in here and then map over those list items. So I'm going to say list items.map. And then for each of those items, I'm going to just go ahead and pull out my item, and I'm going to create some JSX from that. So I'm going to have an li, and then of course we're going to have a span tag in here with the item itself. And then we also want a key to keep React happy here. So I'm going to say key equals the item. It's just a string, so that should work perfectly. And of course they're all unique, so those list items should work well. So we're seeing our list items right here now. So that's good. Below that, we'll want our two buttons. So I'm going to create a div below that to hold our buttons. We know that we already have a cut corner button component, so I'm going to import that. So I'm going to import cut corner button, and then I'm just going to drop that in the bottom of our code. So I'm going to say cut corner button, and that's going to have a text of get started. And then beside that, we're also going to have a learn more button. Now we already have this same style of button used elsewhere in the page right above in our cards. So if I scroll up and look at our cards, we're already using that same button here. So this is probably a good opportunity, because we were using this same style of button, to go ahead and create a reusable component. So let's see if we can go ahead and do that right now. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out my sidebar, and I'm first going to go ahead and go get that code. So inside of our cards, that would be in our features cards section. Let me open up that section, and then I'll scroll down and find where that button is located. So we have a couple of things here. It looks like we have the button here is the one that is the learn more button that we're targeting right now. So we have text small, font heading uppercase, font extra bold, tracking wider. Okay, all that looks right. So I'm going to just copy this code, and I'm going to create a file within my components folder, and we're going to call this textbutton.tsx. And then inside that, we're going to export a const of text button, and that's going to be a function that takes some props and returns some JSX. For now, I'm just going to copy and paste the JSX I had from my features cards section. And I'm going to go ahead and bring in this TW merge so that we have that. So I'm going to import TW merge so that this is brought into this file. And we are going to allow this button to change based on the color prop that gets passed into it. So we can go ahead and do a couple of things here. Number one, we want to allow the user of the button to change the class name. So we're going to have props. And up till now, every single one of our props TypeScript types has always been component props without ref, which is going to continue to be the case here, except for we're going to add on the ability to pass in a color. So I'm going to say component props without ref button and color. And if you pass that in, it's going to be a string. So that's going to be the type for that. And then we can go ahead and destructure our props by saying const, we'll pull out class name, and we'll also pull out color. And then that will allow us to use both class name and color. And of course, we also want children, because we don't want to define what the text is right here. We want children as well. So I'm going to pull out children. So class name, children, and color. Once we've done that, we can go ahead and drop those in. So for our class name, we know that we want to add that onto the end of our TW merge to basically say, if you want to pass in a custom class name, go for it. That's what's going on there. For children, we want to drop that in place of our text. So we're going to make that children. And then for color, we actually already have a way to define that. We have color equals right here. So we have some handlers for color. So if they pass in nothing, it'll just be this fuchsia 500. But if they pass in either lime, cyan, or violet, then they'll be able to change that button color to those specific colors. And of course, we can also just change it by passing in a custom class name, but it'd be kind of better in this case, I think, to use the color prop. So I'm going to just go ahead and try and stick to that if we can. So I'm going to save that. That looks like we have a reusable text button. So we're going to drop it into our current section that we're working on, our features grid, and we're going to go back and of course drop it into our features cards as well. So I'm going to say right here, text button, and we're going to say learn more, which I believe is the content for that particular button. And it looks like it is. So let me just double check that. Okay, that looks good. And that looks like it's actually right already. And then of course we want to replace this right here in our features cards with this new text button component as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop it above it, this current button. So text button, just to ensure that I don't need to copy and paste anything. If I hit enter, it should import it, but I'm going to double check that it did that. And it does look like it did import that automatically. So let's come back down to our text button. And let's go ahead and make sure the text for that is learn more. And we also want to pass in the color prop. So I'm going to say color equals color. And that's going to pass in the color that we're already looping over from our card data. So each of our card data cards has a color associated with it. It's going to be one of the ones that we've already defined here. So when we pass that color in, it should change the color appropriately. So let's just double check on that. We're going to remove this button here just by commenting it out for a second and save that, and just double check that if we go over to our tablet view, that we still see our colored button correctly. And it looks like we do, which means it looks like all of this is working as we intended. So let me go ahead and remove this commented code and leave our text button right here. So I'm going to save that as well. And I'm just going to go ahead and close out features, cards, and come back to the grid. We also don't need text button up here anymore. I'm just going to close that out and come back to our grid. And I'm going to close out our sidebar just to give us a little bit more room to work with. So scrolling back down, coming back over to the mobile view, we can see that we have the first section of our content here. So it looks like the content is all there for that particular part of the section. So I'm going to wrap that all in one div like so. And then for the second div below it, we can go ahead and start to create that content if we can scroll down enough to kind of see the content, which we can't quite scroll down enough for that yet. So I'm going to go ahead and just start working on this top div first. So for the H2, of course, we need to go ahead and make sure that our title text is updated. So I'm going to give this a class name of font heading, of course, to make it the right font family. We also want to say font black to make it the right weight. We're going to say text 4XL. Hopefully that's the right font size. It looks like it is. And we also want to go ahead and make sure that this section already has some padding. So I think we're using PY24. Let's try that for this one and see if that continues to work. So I'm going to say PY24 and scroll up and down. It looks like that aligns it with our design. And I'm not seeing anything else right offhand that we need to do with ACE2, so I'm going to leave it alone and work on our paragraph below it. So I'm going to give this a class name as well. This class name is going to first change the text size. So I'm going to say text XL to change that text size up. We're also going to change the text color with text zinc 400 to darken that up just a little bit. We're going to say MT8. Hopefully that should be the right amount of margin. And I think that's it for this mobile view. And then our UL, we're going to be a little bit more complex because of course we have to create these icons as well as the list items themselves. So for that UL, what we're going to want to do is make sure we have this flexed in the column direction. So class name equals flex call. And then between each of those, we want a gap of 32 pixels. So I'm going to put that in there. And we also want a margin from our paragraph. So MT12 should take care of that. And then let's go ahead and start to update some of our text styles. So in here, we want the text to be extra large, it looks like. So let me try text XL. That should be 20 pixels in font size. And then we want the weight to change as well. So I'm going to say font bold to update the font weight. And that looks like that's correct right now. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that as is. And then of course we need to create this additional icon. So I'm going to do that with two different divs. So I'm going to create a wrapping div, and inside that we're going to have another div for each of these. So for our outer circle and of course our inner dot. For our inner dot, let's work on that first. I'm going to say class name equals, and we're going to say size 1.5 to make that a 6 by 6 pixel. And we're going to give that a BG of fuchsia 500. That should make that, and then rounded full should make that a circle. And then for the outer circle, we can say class name equals and give this inline flex because of course we were going to center this inner circle. So we're going to say justify center items. Center. We'll make this a size of 8, which will be 32 pixels by 32 pixels. And then we also want to put an outline on the outside of this as well, like we've been doing with some of these other divs. So I'm going to say outline 4 to make this a 4 pixel outline, negative outline offset 4 to bring it inside of our div. We're going to say rounded full to make sure that it has the proper border radius. And then we'll just make the outline a different color by coming back to our outline classes and saying outline fuchsia 500/20, I believe should be the right opacity. Actually, it looks like it's a little bit lighter than that. Get /10. That should be correct. Now, in order to get our list items showing with a little bit of space in between and centered correctly, we'll of course need to make sure that this list item here is flexed. So I'm going to give this a class name as well I'm going to say flex, and then we'll center everything with items center, and we'll say gap 3 to give it 12 pixels of spacing in between. We don't want this div to ever shrink. So right now, if you can kind of see this, there's a little bit of shrinkage that's going on. It's kind of compressing that circle. We don't want that to ever happen. So next to our inline flex, we'll say flex shrink 0, and that should keep it from ever shrinking. It will always stay the same size, no matter how much Flexbox thinks it needs to come down in size. So that looks correct to me. And then below that, we'll just need to go ahead and style up our buttons container. So I'm going to give this a class name of flex to put those side by side. We'll want to set the gap between those at gap 8. So that will take care of that. And then we'll of course want to give this some margin top. We'll say margin top 12 to give that the right amount of margin top. This first part is looking great to me. Let's go ahead and overlay the design and see if it still looks as good as it does without it overlaid. So I'm overlaying the design and I'm not seeing any differences right now. That's giving me a lot of confidence that we've done this correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and pull back my reference image to that side by side. And let's see if we can scroll down and actually see our second part of our content, which it looks like now we can, now that we have some margin and spacing up here. So let me go ahead and start to work on this second part of the content. We have one div right here that ends right here. So we're going to go ahead and want to start the second one. We want everything to be inside of our container because of course we still want it within that container to keep it from touching the edges of the screen. So I'm going to create my second div right here, and then we'll go ahead and put our content in here. So it's going to be an H2, and we can see that it says Block Forge leads the way. And then we have a couple of paragraphs below that. So we have a paragraph first that says Block Forge is dedicated to supporting the evolution of Web 3 applications by delivering the necessary infrastructure and security for Web 3. And then in our second paragraph, it looks like it says Block Forge champions Web 3 for everyone. As a decentralized blockchain scaling platform, Block Forge enables developers to create scalable, user-friendly dApps with low transaction costs, all while ensuring robust security. So let's see if those paragraphs look correct. I don't think I made any mistakes there, but there we go. We have our two paragraphs, and then below that we have two buttons. We know that those are going to go inside a div so that we can flex those in the future. Our first one is just our cut corner button. So let me go ahead and drop that component in. Cut corner button, we'll say get started. And then our second one is going to be our text button, and that one's going to say learn more as well. So with that, that should be the content for this section. Let's see if we have all of that content in there correctly. It looks like right now we do, so we can start to style some of this content up. The first thing we're going to do before we style the content up is I'm going to go ahead and set the gap between these two parts of the content by going ahead and wrapping these two divs in another div that's going to be flexed to the column direction. So I'm going to wrap this in another div, give this a class name of flex and flex call. That's going to wrap it in the column direction. And then I just want to give it a gap of 48 to give it 192 pixels of gap in between there. And that should be the right amount of gap. It looks like it is right now. We'll double check that when we complete the styling for this second section, but that should allow us to just have the gap in between those. And then for this H2, we're going to have similar styles to the title on the other part of this section. So I'm going to say class name equals font heading. We know that it's going to be font black to be the proper font weight. We also know it's going to be text 4XL. That should be the right font size. Let me just double check that it's still looking good. And everything looks like it's the right size there. So let's go ahead and just save that again. And then down in our paragraphs, we're going to have two paragraphs that are going to mirror each other in style. So I'm going to say class name. And in fact, we could just go ahead and probably wrap these paragraphs in a div and flex them. That way we can style them both together. So I'm going to say div class name equals flex call. And then we can use that one div to give them both styles by saying text XL. And then we want them to be text zinc 400 to give them the right color. These paragraphs are going to be MT6 with also a gap of 6 between them to give them the same amount of margin. And then it looks like we need a little bit more of a gap in between these two sections of the page. So I'm going to double check on that. Let's see if we need this maybe to be 52 to get this all the way down. It looks like it's even more, a little bit more than that. So let's try 56 and see if that makes them parallel to the design. That looks a lot better. So we're going to leave that at 56. And then of course we need to get our buttons down here as well. So I'm going to give this button div a class name of flex. We're going to give that a gap of 3, I believe. No, that's a little bit too small. Let's try a gap of 8, and then MT12 should give it the top margin that we need. So with those styles in place, let's go ahead and overlay our design on top of our page and see if everything looks correct. And as I scroll up and down over this second section, it does look like things are right, except for there's something going on right there. I may have misspelled something, or yes, I did misspell something. So let me go ahead and save that again. And now it looks like it is correct. So as I scroll up and down, I do see that now it looks right. So that works for the mobile view. We know that things are going to change as we get into the tablet view. So let's go ahead and pull this back out side by side and then look at what we need to do in our tablet view. As we move over into our tablet view, let's go ahead and take a look at how our design looks versus our page right now. So we can see, let's go over to our page. We can see that we don't have any images showing yet. In fact, we haven't even included any images in this section. It looks like we also have some text size that's changing. Those are the big things. We do want the grid. We want to wrap this in a grid, and we want essentially the text to be 2 columns and the image to take up 1 column, and then go ahead and overflow off of the page where need be to make it the right size. So let's go ahead and implement all of those different changes to the tablet portion of this features grid. So if I come into my first part of my grid here, we can see that it is wrapped in a div. So let's go ahead and update that to go ahead and add a grid class. I'm going to say div class name equals, and in fact, let's go ahead and actually just make that a column. We'll go ahead and wrap this whole div. Let me go ahead and pull this in. We'll go ahead and wrap this whole thing in a div. And then in this div, we'll say class name equals grid, and it's going to be grid calls 3 for 3 columns. And then we know that our text, we want to take up 2 columns. So in this div, I'm going to say class name equals call span 2. That should ensure that it takes up 2 of our 3 columns. And then we're going to have another div that's going to hold our images. And in fact, we can go ahead and bring those in. I'm going to create an image. In fact, I'm going to create 2 images. The first one is going to have a source of /assets /images /Taurus not.png. And in JSX, we'll go ahead and end that like that. And we'll have an alt tag of Taurus not 3D image. And then the second image is going to be our hemisphere. So I'm going to say img source equals /assets /images /hemisphere.png. And then alt is going to be hemisphere 3D shape. And go ahead and have a self-closing tag there. As we scroll up, we have both of those images showing here. And of course, we have our text. And now we need to see what we need to do to those different things to get them to match our design. The first thing we definitely need to do is we need to update our text to be a bigger size. So I'm going to come down to my title. I'm going to say at the medium size, we're going to make our text 5XL, and that should make it the right size for this. Let me double check and ensure that we're still seeing the right part of this page. We are, and we have medium text 5XL. Oh, my bad. I was editing the wrong part of the page. Let me go ahead and remove that. Let's come into this column that we're spanning to, where our text right here, and let's make this at the medium size. We add a medium modifier. We'll say text 5XL, and that should ensure that the text is the right size. And that looks like that lines up. And then of course we need to adjust our images so that they not only look right, but that they're the right size as well. For our Taurus not image, let me go ahead and add a class name to that. And that is going to be size 96 to make it 384 by 384. And we'll save that. We'll also want to add a max width of none so that we allow it to overflow off of the side of the page. That's perfectly fine. And then for the hemisphere, we also want to add a class name to that as well. This hemisphere is going to be absolutely positioned according to whatever is going on with this other image, because we of course want it to come up underneath this other image. So we're going to say absolute here. we're going to give it the same size. We're going to say size 96. That's fine as well. And then we're going to pull it up under by saying top 3/4. And that's just going to come down 3/4 of the way from the top of whatever our relative positioned div is. We don't have one of those yet, so I'm going to go ahead and add a relative class on here. That should ensure that it comes up to the right spot in the page. Now it looks like what we actually needed to do was go ahead and wrap another div just around this image or around both of these images so that we had a good relative position instead of using our grid div. So let me go ahead and just remove this class name here and just create a new div around these images, and that will allow us to go ahead and set the relative positioned div in the right place. So I'm going to say class name equals, and we're going to say relative, and of course inline flex should make sure that it's just wrapped around that image tightly. And then now we do see that this is in the right spot at least. Now we know that we need to adjust z index to pull it beneath the other image. So let me just set a z index of 0 on this, and then our hemisphere image will set a negative z10 index, and that should pull it below our torus knot that we're seeing right here. In order to flip this left to right, because of course it looks like it's kind of facing away from this section, but over in the design, if we pull out our design a little bit, we can get a better look at this. We can see that it's actually facing towards this section over here. So we're actually flipping this on the x-axis, and this actually isn't too hard to do. We just need to give it a scale of -1 if I'm not mistaken. So let's go ahead and do that by just saying scale x, and then we're just going to say -1. And that should flip that hemisphere image around and make it face our section, which of course we can see that it does. Now I'm still able to scroll over left and right, and we can see that we have that overflow icon at the bottom that's warning us that we have horizontal overflow detected. We don't want horizontal overflow, so let's go ahead and make sure that this section is prepared to cut off any horizontal overflow by just going ahead and adding overflow x clip to the section, and that should make sure that we don't have any overflow as we scroll left and right. And of course that icon is now gone because we don't have any more of that. Now that our images are in place and our text is changed, let's go ahead and lay our design on top of our page and see if everything looks right. The thing that I'm seeing is that we don't have any spacing between our columns. So even though we have 3 different columns, there's no gap in between. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a gap of 8 for 32 pixels. That should push the image over to where it needs to be. And that looks like that was the problem. So that wasn't hard to figure out, but that was definitely something that we needed in that grid. So now that that is looking good, let's go down to the second part of this section and see what we need to do for this one as well. We can see that we once again need to increase the font size, and of course we need another grid, but this one needs to be 1 column and then 2 columns instead of the other way around. So let me go ahead and fold my first grid up, and let's come down to our second content div, which is this one right here. And let's go ahead and fold that up as well, just so we can wrap a div around it. So I'm gonna say div class name equals, this is gonna be where our grid is. We're gonna say grid calls 3 again. We're gonna go ahead and give it that gap of 8 because we know that we're gonna need that, and wrap it around all of our content. And then this time we're going to create the div that's going to hold our images right here. That's where our images are going to go. And then this content div is going to be spanning 2 columns instead of the first one. So I'm going to say class name equals call span 2, and that should allow it to span 2 columns. And let's go over and see how this is looking right now. So we are getting these in the right place. Now let's go ahead and drop in our images into this first div. So I'm going to come inside this div and say image source equals. The first one is going to be our cone. So /assets/images/cone.png. We're going to give this an alt tag of cone 3D shape. And I'm going to have a self-closing tag there. And then the second one is going to be image source equals /assets/images/hemisphere again. And the alt is going to be hemisphere 3D shape. And once those images are on there, of course, we need to go ahead and modify these so that they match the design as well. And we need to make sure that this cone is bigger. So let's go ahead and set that. We know that this is a div. We want to create another div around these images. We already went through this problem. So I'm going to go ahead and create another div around these images. We're going to make that div. We're going to say class name equals relative. And we're going to make our cone shape. We're going to give it a class name as well. We're going to say size 96 with a max width of none. that should make it the right size. And then we just need to ensure that it's positioned in the right spot. So the way that we're going to have to do that is we're actually going to have to make this, instead of relative, this one is actually going to have to be absolute in this case. So I'm going to say absolute there, and then we're going to make the wrapping grid div, we're going to say class name equals relative here in order to get this lined up. And then once this is absolute, we can just say right 0, and hopefully that should push our content over in the right spot so that we have that right 0 taking effect. It looks like it is, but our cone is a little bit rotated in our design. So let's see if we can rotate that by, let's just say 12 degrees, and hopefully that should match our design a lot better. It looks like it is matching better, and let's just make sure that our hemisphere is also in the right spot. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and give it a class name as well. We're going to make sure that it is position absolute. So I'm going to say absolute. And we also want to say top 3/4 as well. And that should hopefully pull it to the right spot. It's almost right. We need to adjust the Z index here. So I'm going to say Z0 on this. And of course, we're going to say negative Z10 on the hemisphere. That should bring it below our cone. That looks like it is aligned with the way that the design is created. The only other thing I'm seeing on this particular section is our section title. It's definitely a little bit bigger in the design than it is in our current code. So for this section as well, we need to say that at the medium size, the text becomes 5XL on our title, and hopefully that will align it with the way that the design looks. So let me go ahead and overlay once again our design on top of our code and see if everything looks right. It definitely looks a little bit off, and it might be some form of margin, or maybe the spacing in between might have changed in this size. So right now we have a gap of 56 in between. So let's say at the medium size, let's increase that gap. Let's just say to 64 and see if that is correct. I'm gonna go ahead and overlay this again. And actually it's not, it's actually coming down a little bit. So let me come back to 56. Yep, that gets a little bit closer. And in this, let's say medium gap 48, and let's see if that's any closer. And that looks like that is correct. The other thing that I'm seeing is it looks like this hemisphere is a little bit out of place in one spot or the other. So let me increase my design. It looks like the hemisphere is to the right, and as I pull that back, it looks like my hemisphere is then to the left. So let's see if we can adjust the hemisphere over to the right. Let me see if I can add a right 0 and see if that fixes our problem by just going ahead and doing that. And as I look a little bit closer, it looks like we have this rotate 12 that's actually happening for both our cone and our hemisphere, but it really should be happening only for our cone, not our hemisphere. So I'm going to cut that and put it into our cone image, and that makes it align with the design exactly as we'd want it to. Now that that's taken care of, it looks like we have our design aligned to what we have on the screen, which is a great place to be in. Let's go ahead over to desktop. I'm going to pull my reference image back out to side by side, and then I'm going to head over to desktop and see if we still have things aligned to the design. Let's go ahead and pull out the desktop view just to get a better view of what's going on over here. So everything is looking pretty nice right now. The only difference is we definitely have a little bit of difference in the amount of spacing between our different grid sections right here, and we definitely have a little bit of font size difference as well. So we can see that the title definitely gets even bigger in this view, and that looks to be the major differences for this view. So let's go ahead and take care of those, come back into our code, and then we'll see if we can get this taken care of. So I'm going to go up to my first part of my features grid and make sure that we say at the large size text 6XL. That should take care of the font size change that we saw over here. And those look like they're now the same. And as I scroll down here, we definitely want to make sure that these are the same font size as well. So I'm going to scroll down to my second part of this section and come to my title and say large text 6XL as well. And that should make that the right font size. I'm going to scroll over and see that those look like the right size. And it does look like they are, but we definitely need to split our grids by even more distance in this particular size. So let's see, we right now have a gap of 48. We know that that needs to be a lot bigger at this size. So let me go ahead and overlay my reference image, and then we can figure out what that gap needs to be at this size. So I'm going to start with a large gap of 80 and then see how close that gets us. And we will see, I'm not sure if we're too far or too shallow. So let me try 72 and see if that gets us closer or further away. It looks like it's a little bit further away. So let's try 80 again. We're getting closer, but we're just a little bit off with our gap. I don't know if we have, let me try this again, large gap, and let's see what values we have as we scroll down here. We have 80 and then we jump right to 96. So we might need to add a custom value here to make this work. So if we say gap 80, that is going to represent 320 pixels. So let's just go ahead and say 320 pixels, and then we can adjust that 320 pixel number. So let's try 328 and let's see if we're any closer. It looks like we're definitely getting closer if we're not already there. The text looks right, the title looks right. We have a little bit of difference in our size as well. So that may have been accounting for the difference that we were seeing here. So this isn't perfect, the title is, but none of the other text is perfect up here. And I think that has to do with the size of our paragraph text at this screen size as well. So let's go ahead and we'll mess with that after we ensure that our size of our paragraph text is right. So in this view, in the medium view is text XL. Let's see if at the large view, if text 2XL is the answer for our paragraph size. I'm going to scroll a little bit to see. And yes, it looks like we needed to bring the paragraph size up here. And I'm assuming that's the same down here. So let's come down to our two paragraphs down here and we'll ensure that they're the right size by saying large text 2XL here as well. And let's see if those get any better. And it looks like they are right, but of course it's super blurry because we don't have the right gap anymore. So let's try gap of 80 again. And let's see if that is the answer that we're looking for. Scroll up and down. Yes, it looks like now we're aligned with our design. So let's bring the code over once again, bring our view back out and ensure that we are exactly aligned to our design. And it looks like now we are. As I come back through my views to ensure that I didn't break anything, everything still looks good at all of our responsive views. This is a really great section. Oh, I do see that we do have some breakage down on our mobile view, and that's because we forgot to make sure that our third column of our grid is hidden, or our grid should be one column and we should definitely be hiding our images at that size. So let's go ahead and open up our code again and ensure that we have that taken care of as well. So I'm gonna come right over here and find where we have our images. So this is the first div down here in the mobile view. So we want our grid to be 3 columns across as long as it's medium, but when it's small, we only really want it to be 1 column. So I'm going to say grid calls 1, and at the medium size, we're going to go up to 3 columns. So that's how that's going to work. And then the other thing is we don't want our images to show at all at this size. So I'm going to come down here and say that after our call span 2, we have this div right here. This div should not be showing, so it's going to have a class name of hidden, and then when it reaches the medium size, we can go ahead and show it again with block. So let's try that and see how that works. So that looks right there. And then we need to do the same thing down here in the second portion of this section. So let's go ahead and do the same thing by saying grid calls 1 and then medium grid calls 3. And then this relative div is going to be what we're going to be hiding on this particular section. So we're going to say hidden and then medium block again. And that should allow our images to be hidden until we want them to be shown. So I'm seeing that looks like it's all aligned now. And coming back through to our different responsive views, it looks like they are aligned again. And then over on desktop, pulling out our browser a little bit more so that we can see this, it does look like those look aligned as well. So everything looks great, which means it's time to move on to the next section. That completes part 1 of this project. Be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for part 2, where we'll complete the homepage and start adding in these impressive animations. In the meantime, here's something you can watch next.